In this video, we're exploring 3 terrifying stories that took place in the Appalachian Mountains during one of my absolute favorite natural phenomena: thunderstorms. I've been wanting to make a video on this topic for a while now, but I decided to wait and post it today for 2 main reasons. First, October and thunderstorms are the perfect combination. Second, well, it's my birthday, so it just felt like the right time. Thank you so much for being here and for choosing to support this channel. I truly hope you enjoy this video as much as I enjoyed reading and putting these stories together. If you have any suggestions, please leave them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. What I'm about to tell you happened to me last year, around the middle of October. But before I dive into what actually went down, I just need to give you a little context about why I was even in a place that isolated in the first place. The reason I'm pointing this out is because everything happened during about 2 weeks of massive storms. It rained all day. It rained all night. And this exact week this year, it's been the same way. It hasn't stopped raining or thundering. And I don't really know why, but this weather dragged me right back to that time, and I figured maybe it was time to finally talk about it. Basically, I lived with my parents until I started working in another state, and finally got a little bit of freedom. But about 1.5 years after working there, I ended up getting into a fight with a coworker, and we both got fired. Let me just make it clear. It wasn't entirely my fault. Of course, it was wrong to punch someone at work. It was childish not to control my emotions. But I swear I had reached a point where I just couldn't take it anymore. He was the kind of guy who had been harassing me since day one. He'd pull pranks on me, talk shit about me, mock me. I had never even given him a reason to act that way. We had never talked about anything that could have triggered some weird reaction. And I never treated him badly. But for whatever reason, he developed some kind of obsession with me and wouldn't leave me alone. So after punching him and us getting into a fight right there in the office, we both ended up without jobs. With no real prospects of finding something new right away, I had to move back in with my parents. It was supposed to be temporary, just long enough to get back on my feet and figure something out. But the months kept dragging on and nothing came up that would actually allow me to leave. And the thing is, once you've lived on your own and had your independence, moving back in with your parents is honestly one of the worst things that can happen to a person. One day, I was having coffee with an old high school friend, and he picked up on how miserable I was. That's when he told me about this cabin he owned, right in the middle of the woods, where he usually spent his summers. He'd only go there once a year and stay for 3 months. He basically offered me the place for the winter months, rent-free. All he asked in return was that I kept the place in shape while I was there. I hesitated a little at the idea of being in the middle of nowhere, but at least I could drive right up to the cabin. And like I said, I was desperate. I remember leaving that coffee shop with this rush of excitement, like for the first time in a while, I had a way out. I even walked home in pouring rain, not even caring about getting soaked. 4 days later, I was leaving my parents' house with the car packed and headed straight to the cabin. I had thought about waiting for the storm to calm down a bit, because driving through the woods with low visibility wasn't exactly safe. But the forecast said the storm wasn't going to let up for at least another week. So I figured it was better to just go. Another week trapped in that house with controlling parents, knowing I had an alternative, would have been unbearable. So yeah, 4 days after being handed that escape, I was on the road, driving toward the cabin. The trip would take about 2.5 hours, and since visibility was low and I had to take it slow, I left early in the morning. The road was tough, winding through nothing but forest, and for about an hour I didn't see a single sign of life except for a few isolated places that hinted someone might live out there. When I finally arrived, I couldn't believe how incredible the cabin was. It wasn't nearly as small as I had imagined, and it was fully ready to live in. I can't even explain the rush of pure excitement I felt that first week. I was free from my parents' control, free from that suffocating job, and for the first time in my life, it felt like the forest was giving me a clean slate. Maybe the storm was some kind of sign, a moment of chaos before things finally settled. I was convinced of it. I developed this little routine during that first week, spending my days between exploring the inside of the cabin and wandering around just outside whenever the rain softened enough to actually see the forest. At night, I'd light the fireplace, crack one of the windows open, and just soak in the darkness of the woods, the sound of the storm, and the crackle of the fire. I swear I'd never felt that kind of calm before. It got to the point where I was actually looking forward to nightfall just to hear those sounds. But obviously, the last thing you should ever do out there is keep the windows open at night in the middle of nowhere. The sound was so soothing that one night I actually fell asleep on the couch with the window wide open right above me. I woke up around 4 a.m. to what sounded like something breaking, like glass shattering. And that's when I saw something that froze me to the core. The fireplace was still burning, so its light cast this flickering glow across the floor. And right there, cutting through that glow, were footprints. Footprints I knew weren't mine. They had a clear direction, starting right at the couch where I'd been sleeping, which meant whoever or whatever came in through the window had climbed in right above me. The thought alone sent a kind of fear through me that I'd never felt before. The footprints went toward the fireplace, then toward the smaller couch pushed up against the other window. Whoever had entered had sat there, watching me sleep. Another thought that made my stomach drop. Then the footprints led to the kitchen, the direction of the sound that had woken me up. I snapped out of the initial shock just enough to feel that heavy, unmistakable sensation that someone was still inside with me. I crept toward the fireplace, grabbed the sharpest tool I could find, and crouched in the corner, waiting. That's when I started noticing even more details that made my skin crawl. The footprints were bare, but the shape wasn't normal. They looked warped, twisted. And from the kitchen I could hear this breathing, quick and shallow, mixed with what sounded like a whimper. It was like someone crying, but it wasn't human crying. Not really. I shifted my weight, because my legs were going numb. And without realizing it, I slipped and hit my back against the wall. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough. The breathing stopped, and in the middle of the storm outside, there was this heavy silence filling the cabin, like it was swallowing every bit of sound except the rain and thunder. Then it happened too fast for my brain to keep up. Something, or someone, shot out of the kitchen into the living room and leapt through the window. It was so fast, I barely had time to react. And I swear to God, I had never felt terror like that in my life. It wasn't running upright like a normal person. Or at least, not completely. Its back was arched in this way that reminded me of someone really old. But there's no way someone that old could move like that. That speed, that agility, it wasn't right. It took me several seconds just to process what had happened. But when I finally managed to snap out of it, I ran to the window and slammed it shut. That's when I saw it. In the middle of the darkness, between the trees, two glowing eyes were staring right at me. I locked every window, every shutter. The kitchen was a mess. Two glasses shattered on the floor, and in one of them there was this weird, black, sticky residue. I have no idea what the hell that was. But I spent the entire night on edge, cleaning up everything, wiping away the muddy footprints from the floor, trying to hold myself together. By the time the sun came up, the cabin was spotless, and all my bags were lined up by the door, ready to get the hell out of there. Of course, I told my friend everything, but I honestly don't think he really believes me. All he said was that he'd never seen anything like that out there, but he'd keep an eye out. To this day, I have no idea what I saw that night, but it was without a doubt the most terrifying night of my life. It's funny how clear that night still feels to me, even though it's been, what, 3 autumns now? Must have been mid-October, because the trees up here on the ridge had already gone that deep burnt orange and brown, and you could smell the wood smoke from miles off. We'd had a long stretch of dry days, and when the forecast said a thunderstorm was rolling through, I remember feeling weirdly excited, like a kid again. I've always loved storms. It was something I inherited from my mother. Whenever there was a storm, she was absolutely captivated. She'd stop everything she was doing just to absorb the sound. I remember sitting with her many times doing the same thing. And because of that, whenever there was a storm, I not only loved listening to it, but also felt that warm, cozy sense of nostalgia. Those childhood days when the only worry was playing. It was definitely something I passed on to my kids. Ellie was 9 back then, and Sam had just turned 7. Both of them had that same look in their eyes when they heard thunder, like it was Christmas morning. My wife, Marla, hated it, said storms made her anxious. Anyway, we live way out deep in the Appalachians. Not quite West Virginia, not quite Tennessee, but somewhere in that messy in-between, where the roads turn to gravel, and you lose cell signal after the second turn. I'm not exaggerating. That's really how it is out here. Our nearest neighbor's about 5 minutes away by car, maybe more when the road's washed out. We were lucky enough to inherit this house from my parents, who unfortunately both passed away quite young. But the house itself was perfect, ideal for raising our kids. Both Marla and I wanted to bring them up surrounded by nature and far from the chaos of the cities. That night, the sky had been heavy all day. That kind of weird yellow-gray color you get before a storm. Around 8, the wind picked up and the first thunder rumbled across the ridge. The kids came running into the kitchen all smiles, begging to sit out on the back porch to watch it roll in. So we bundled up in hoodies and ran outside just as the first fat drops started to fall. The porch light buzzed, the screen door slammed, and the smell of rain hit. That damp, cold, earthy smell that always means fall's really here. definitely one of the best smells in life. Now, the back porch overlooks a big slope down into the woods. Beyond that, nothing but darkness and trees that go for miles. I had my old radio playing low, the kind that still picks up stations from God knows where when the air's right, and we just sat there, me, Sam, and Ellie, listening to thunder crack and roll like it was crawling over the mountains. My wife stayed inside, curled up by the fireplace in her favorite reading spot. At some point, lightning flashed bright enough to light up the whole yard, and Ellie pointed, dead serious, out toward the tree line. "Dad, someone's out there." I laughed at first. I mean, it's dark. The rain's playing tricks on your eyes, right? But then another flash hit, and this time I saw something. A shape. I couldn't tell what it was, and I thought it might have just been a tree or a trunk with an odd shape. But I looked closer, fixed my eyes on the spot. And then I saw it again. Looked like a person. Standing still, half hidden by one of the trees at the bottom of the hill. My stomach kinda dropped. If it really was someone, and they'd been watching us, they'd probably realized we'd seen them. The kids started pointing right in that direction, and I kept staring for a long while. I told the kids to go inside and turn on the back floodlights. They didn't argue, just scrambled in through the screen door. I stayed put, waiting. The lights came on, bright white cutting through the rain. But there wasn't anybody there anymore. Just empty yard and wet grass bending in the wind. Which meant it wasn't just a weirdly shaped trunk. It was something capable of moving. And scarier than seeing it, there was the fact that it had been there moments before. But now I didn't know where it was. Didn't know if it had gone away or come closer. I told myself it was probably an animal. Hell, maybe even a deer standing weird. Nobody had ever come that close to the house before, but plenty of deer had, so that had to be the explanation. My wife had always loved animals, and sometimes they'd wander closer when she was around. Maybe it was a scared animal looking for shelter from the storm. But I still locked up every door in that house, front and back, and told Marla what we'd seen. I added that we should stay alert, but that there wasn't much reason to think something was wrong. Whatever it was, it had gone away. I felt bad lying to her like that, but I didn't want to ruin the night without a good reason. We settled in for the night, storm still pounding the roof. Watched some dumb Halloween movie with the kids till about 10. Eventually, we got them to bed, or tried to. Not 15 minutes later, Sam came out of his room pale as paper. Said someone was knocking on his window. My whole body tensed, and Marla's face went petrified. Now, you gotta understand. His window faces the woods side of the house. No porch, no easy way to reach it. Meaning no one could possibly just peek in or knock on it. Maybe he was still scared from what he'd seen outside and was making it up just so he wouldn't have to sleep alone. Either way, I wasn't going to ignore what he'd just told me. So I went upstairs to his room. I took the flashlight with me, since by that point the power had already gone out. But when I got to his room, I was absolutely horrified. Lightning flashed again, and for a split second, I swear I saw a man's face. Just a shape. But it was there, right against the glass. I yelled, grabbed my old man's gun, and tore out the back door before Marla could even stop me. Rain coming down sideways, thunder so loud it shook the siding. I ran around to the side, where Sam's room was, but there was nobody there. I stood there for a long moment, looking around, trying to figure out where he'd gone, how he'd even managed to look in through the window. But when I turned toward the front, I saw movement. A man, wearing a hooded coat, slipping around the corner of the house. I ran after him, feet sliding in the mud, heart hammering in my throat. I was obviously terrified, but I wasn't about to let him lay a hand on my family. But by the time I rounded the corner, gone. Just the wind and the sound of the rain. That night, we all stayed in the same room. Marla and I awake, listening for any noise. The kids were in our bed, all of us pretending to sleep, but really just waiting for another knock, another flash, another sound. But nothing else happened. Morning came, and with it, the storm calmed down. For a good 2 weeks afterward, we were all pretty tense. We installed security cameras around the property and reinforced the kids' bedroom windows. But nothing ever happened again. We never saw any man, and we have no idea what he wanted. It's strange how something that shattered my life still smells the same when I think about it. Wet leaves, cold metal, that sharp electrical bite in the air right before a storm breaks. I can close my eyes, and I'm right back there. 15, pissed off at the world, half-packed boots not walking straight into the worst night of my life. Everything I'm about to tell you happened more than 30 years ago, but it changed me forever. Especially the way I react to thunderstorms. Back then, my parents were dirt poor. Hell, everyone in that tiny mountain town was. Poor doesn't even cover it. It was straight up miserable. No real jobs, just endless days working yourself to the bone for scraps. My family wasn't any different. And I guess that's part of why everything went down the way it did that night. It was pouring harder than I'd ever seen. Thunder cracked like it was splitting the sky in half, shaking the paper-thin walls of the piece of shit house we called home. Calling it a house was generous. Parts of it might as well have been outdoors. Rain leaked in through the ceiling. Cold wind slipped through holes, and every storm felt like a fight to keep warm and dry. My dad had just come home from work, pissed off like always, ready to unload on me and my mom. I could tell it was going to be bad the second he stepped inside. There was a way he moved, the way he yanked off his boots, that meant he needed to break something. That night, I was done. Tired to the bone. I wasn't going to let him take it out on me again, and I damn sure wasn't going to watch him lay a hand on her. I told him he was a coward, that none of it was our fault, that he didn't have the right to dump all his shit on us. He let me finish talking. Then the slap came hard and fast. My face lit up with pain, but I didn't cry. I snapped. I shoved him back with everything I had. He stumbled, lost his balance, and smashed the back of his head against the corner of a piece of furniture. Panic hit me like a wave. I thought I'd killed him, but he was still breathing. My mom and I dragged him to the bed. I couldn't handle everything burning inside me. Anger, fear, guilt. It was too much. So I threw the front door open and just ran. We lived out in the Appalachian Mountains in Pennsylvania. Running off in the middle of the night wasn't new for me, but doing it during a storm like that was. I sprinted through the fields, rain soaking through every layer, the sky lighting up in white flashes. Eventually, I got scared of getting hit by lightning, so I stopped under a cluster of trees that offered a bit of cover. I was drenched, shivering, but burning up inside. Without thinking, I let out this scream, raw and furious. I lived in a place where I could scream all I wanted. First, it was almost impossible for anyone to actually hear me, especially with the storm roaring like that. And second, it was night. Nobody went into the woods after dark. Not ever. And definitely not after hearing a scream. I was dead wrong. Not even 30 seconds after the scream, I felt something move on my right. I turned, and there was a man. Hood pulled low, holding something long in his hand. It looked like a baseball bat. And the second I saw him, I just knew. He meant me harm. I tried to step back, but he lunged forward and swung. Then, everything went black. When I came to, my head was pounding. It was dark, and the air smelled foul, mold, rot, something sour. I knew exactly where I was. Not far from my house, there were these old ruins everyone called cursed. People said ghosts roamed there. But what scared us more than ghosts was the fact that it was falling apart. The only thing still standing was the shell of an old church. I'd been there before, with some friends. My wrists burned like fire. I realized my hands were tied behind my back with some kind of rough rope. It dug into my skin, too tight. Like whoever did it wanted to make sure I didn't move an inch. Then I heard a voice, and realized I wasn't alone. I couldn't make out what was being said, just the tone. I knew that voice, which made it worse. The door creaked open, slow and heavy, and I heard footsteps fading away. Then daylight slammed into me like a punch. It burned through my eyes, sharp and blinding, and my head felt like it was splitting in two. I don't know how long I stayed there after that. Soaked to the bone, teeth chattering, every muscle locked up. The silence pressed down on me, thick and cold. Nobody came back. It was just me, tied up, waiting for something I couldn't even name. I honestly thought I was gonna die there. Nobody ever came through that area, not unless it was some hunter cutting through the woods, and even that was rare. And it sure as hell wasn't hunting season. Outside, the storm was still raging, pounding against the broken walls like it wanted in. I remember lying there, tied up, soaked, and freezing, knowing no one was coming. Then, finally, the door opened again and a man stepped inside. For a split second, I felt pure terror, and then relief. It was Mr. Buck, our closest neighbor. He was the kind of guy who'd give us potatoes when we couldn't afford dinner. For a heartbeat, I thought maybe he'd been the one who took me. But the panic in his voice killed that thought fast. He was there to help. He rushed to untie me, asking questions I couldn't even process. Who did this? What happened? How long had I been there? I couldn't answer. I just kept whispering, "Thank you," and begging him to hurry. Then the door slammed open again. Another man, the same shadow I'd seen in the woods, was there. The second he saw us, he bolted. Mr. Buck almost ran after him, but I grabbed him with what little strength I had left. I begged without words, and he stayed. He took me home. My mom was sobbing when she saw me, wrapping herself around me like she could keep me from vanishing again. My dad started to raise his voice, until Buck shut him down with a look and a few hard words. There was no police report, no search. No one even knocked on a door to ask what happened. People around there didn't want to get involved. They didn't want trouble. They didn't want their names in anything. So everyone just went quiet, like it never happened. And that was it. Nothing was done. That was it. My parents died young. The house is still there, rotting like it always did. I only went back once, to help Mr. Buck when he was old and alone. One time I asked him how he'd even managed to find me, and he said my mom had shown up at his door, crying and begging for help. My dad couldn't have cared less if I lived or died, so she went to the only person she trusted. Buck told me he'd spent the whole damn night out there searching for me, wandering through the woods with nothing to go on. Any tracks that might have been there were already washed away by the storm. He said he only passed by the old ruins by sheer luck. For a second, he figured maybe I'd run off and taken shelter in the church. He never once thought I'd been kidnapped. I asked him if he had any idea who it was. He said he had his suspicions, and if he was right, that man had been rotting in the ground for a long time. After he passed, whatever tie I still had to that place died with him. I've never gone back. I don't plan to. Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
The whole thing I'm about to tell you started around 3 years ago, and to this day, I still don't have an explanation for it. I've gone over it in my head more times than I can count. I've blamed wildlife, random coincidences, people messing around in the woods, pretty much every logical explanation I could think of. None of them explain everything that happened. Looking back now, I think whatever was going on had probably started long before I noticed it. 3 years ago was just the first time it made itself impossible to ignore. I'm not expecting everyone to believe me. If somebody had told me this story before it happened to me, I probably would have rolled my eyes and come up with a reasonable explanation. Unfortunately, I was the one living through it. I live in a pretty remote part of the Appalachian Mountains. There are a handful of houses scattered around the area, but mine sits farther back than most of them, surrounded by miles of hardwood forest in almost every direction. The closest paved road is several minutes away, and once the sun goes down, the place gets unbelievably quiet. There's also a pretty well-known campground not too far from my property, so seeing unfamiliar vehicles every now and then has never been unusual. People come through all year to hike, camp, fish, or just spend a weekend away from civilization. I've lived in that house for 15 years, and until all of this started, nothing remotely concerning had ever happened. I've seen black bears, coyotes, bobcats, all kinds of wildlife. The animals usually stay away from people, and if you leave them alone, they return the favor. That's just how it works out here. Which is why the first thing that caught my attention didn't even seem like a big deal. One night I got home from work after a long shift, probably a little after 10, and noticed a white cargo van parked in a small clearing between the trees not too far from my driveway. It wasn't on my property, but it was definitely closer to my house than I would have expected someone to camp. My first thought was that it was kind of odd. Personally, if I were spending the night in the woods, I'd rather be farther away from someone else's home, not closer. When I mentioned it to my wife, she looked at it completely differently. She said maybe whoever was staying there had never camped somewhere that isolated before and actually felt safer being within sight of a house. The more I thought about it, the more sense it made. If our situations were reversed, she admitted she probably would have done the exact same thing. By the following morning, the van was gone, and I figured that settled it. Someone had spent the night there and moved on. Except when I came home from work that evening, the van was parked in the exact same spot again. I still didn't think too much about it. Maybe whoever owned it was driving somewhere during the day and returning at night. The part that bothered me happened much later. Around 1 in the morning, I walked outside to take the trash down to the bins, and when I looked toward the clearing, I noticed someone sitting inside the driver's seat. The man wasn't asleep. He had a pair of binoculars pressed to his face. What immediately stood out wasn't that he was awake that late. It was what he was looking at. He wasn't watching my house. The binoculars were pointed deep into the woods on the opposite side of my property, almost like he was waiting for something to come out of the trees. I stood there for a few seconds trying to figure out what had his attention, but I also didn't want him noticing me staring back. I quietly went inside, tried looking through one of the windows, but from that angle, I couldn't really see the clearing anymore. I told my wife what I'd seen, and for the first time, she agreed that something about it felt off. Sitting alone inside a van in the middle of the night, watching the forest through binoculars, wasn't exactly normal behavior. Even so, we locked the doors like we always did, checked the windows, and eventually went to bed. The van was gone again the next morning. As I was walking to my truck before leaving for work, I noticed something that definitely hadn't been there the day before. Just off the edge of my yard, almost directly in front of the house, there was a hole dug into the ground. It wasn't huge, but it also didn't look like someone had used a shovel. The dirt had been ripped apart, and there were long claw marks running through the soil. We'd seen bear tracks before. We'd found signs of coyotes and other predators plenty of times over the years. This looked different. More importantly, it was way too close to the house. Wild animals around here usually avoid homes unless they're desperate or someone has been feeding them. Standing there looking at those marks, I remembered the guy sitting in the van the night before. Maybe he hadn't been watching another person after all. Maybe he was watching whatever had made those tracks. The van disappeared again for the next 3 nights, and little by little, I convinced myself I was reading way too much into the whole thing. Then, a few evenings later, I came home and saw it parked in exactly the same place again. This time, I decided I was going to talk to him. It was around 10:30 when I walked over to the clearing. He must not have heard me coming, because the second I got close enough, he spun toward me and immediately pointed a rifle straight at my chest. I threw my hands up without even thinking. After a few tense seconds, he realized I wasn't there to cause any trouble, lowered the rifle, and cracked the driver's side window. He warned me that I shouldn't be outside after dark if I valued my life. Naturally, I asked him what he meant by that. He explained that he was out there tracking a creature that had supposedly appeared in some confidential report years earlier, before the records disappeared. According to him, there had been multiple sightings somewhere around this part of the mountains, and he'd spent months trying to verify whether any of it was real. Honestly, I figured he was just another guy chasing Appalachian legends. Every year, people come out here convinced they're going to find Bigfoot, monsters, secret government experiments, or whatever else the internet is obsessed with that month. I left that conversation feeling more relieved than anything else, because at least I knew he wasn't sitting out there watching my house. I headed back inside, locked everything up again, and told my wife about the conversation. That's when she mentioned something she hadn't told me before. 2 days earlier, she'd found a dead rabbit behind the house while she was clearing some brush near the tree line. It hadn't just been killed. It had been torn apart, almost shredded, like some predator had ripped it to pieces. She hadn't said anything because she assumed it was just wildlife and didn't want me worrying about it while I was at work. The second she told me that, my mind went right back to the hole in the ground outside and those strange claw marks. For the first time since this all started, I found myself wondering if the man in the van wasn't as crazy as I'd originally assumed. At the same time, I kept telling myself there was probably a perfectly reasonable explanation for all of it. Maybe the guy in the van really was tracking some kind of wild animal, and somewhere along the way, he'd convinced himself it was some undiscovered creature. There are plenty of people who spend their lives chasing stories like that. I wasn't about to believe his explanation just because I'd found one strange hole in the ground, and my wife had found a rabbit torn apart behind the house. Neither of those things proved anything on their own. Around here, wildlife does strange things all the time. The problem was that, later that same night, something happened inside my own house that I couldn't explain away quite so easily. We have 3 cats, all rescues, all of them pulled out of some pretty rough situations before we adopted them. Despite everything they'd been through, they're unbelievably gentle. They don't hiss, they don't fight, and they barely even scratch each other when they're playing. During the day, they love sitting by the windows, watching birds and squirrels, but at night, they usually disappear into quieter parts of the house and sleep somewhere tucked away. That night was completely different. All 3 of them walked over to the front windows and just stood there staring outside. Every few seconds, they'd arch their backs and hiss into the darkness. I'd never seen them behave like that before. It wasn't playful or defensive. They looked genuinely terrified, but at the same time, they refused to back away from the windows, almost like they were trying to warn us that something was out there. At first, I figured they were reacting to the man in the van. They'd never seen him before, and maybe his presence alone was enough to make them nervous. That seemed far more believable than anything else running through my head. Since I couldn't really see the clearing from inside the house unless the van was parked in exactly the right spot, I decided to step outside for a better look. That wasn't unusual for me. I went outside late almost every night to take the trash out or check around the property before going to bed. I grabbed a flashlight, opened the front door, and started walking slowly toward the edge of the yard where I could usually see the clearing through the trees. Before I even made it halfway there, I heard something coming from the woods. It sounded like an animal eating. Wet, repetitive licking noises, followed by slow chewing. Out there, once the sun goes down, the darkness is absolute. Unless there's a bright full moon, you can barely see a few feet beyond the tree line. I stopped walking and turned toward the sound, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The instant I did, the noise stopped completely. Everything went silent. Then I saw them. Two eyes reflecting back at me from just above the ground. My first thought was that it had to be a mountain lion, or maybe some other large predator. My body locked up before my brain had time to process anything else. I knew enough about predators to understand that running was the worst thing I could do. If it was a cat, I'd immediately trigger its instinct to chase. So I started backing away as slowly as I could, keeping my eyes fixed on those two reflections in the darkness. Then the eyes started rising. At first I thought the animal had simply lifted its head, but they kept going, higher and higher, until whatever they belonged to appeared to stand upright. I don't know how tall it actually was, because I couldn't make out a body, only those eyes, but I knew it was far too tall to be a person. Too tall for a bear. Too tall for anything I'd ever seen in those mountains. Every logical explanation disappeared in that moment. I wasn't looking at an animal I recognized anymore. I wasn't even looking at something I could identify. Whatever it was stayed perfectly still, staring directly at me, and every instinct I had screamed that if I stood there another second, I wasn't getting back inside. I turned and sprinted for the front door. I don't even remember unlocking it. I just remember throwing myself inside and slamming it shut behind me. Barely a second later, something hit the outside of the house with enough force to shake the wall. It wasn't loud because of the noise itself. It was loud because of how heavy it sounded. The entire house seemed to absorb the impact. My cats completely lost it. They started hissing even louder, clawing at furniture, running through the house before disappearing into the darkest corners they could find. I locked every door and window as fast as I could. My wife had been in the shower, but even over the sound of the water, she'd heard the impact. She came running out, still soaked, asking what had happened. All I could tell her was that there was something outside. I didn't know what it was, only that it wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. She suggested opening one of the curtains to see if it was still there, but I shut that idea down immediately. Whatever had hit the house had done it with incredible force, and I had no interest in finding out whether it could get through a window if it wanted to. I'm not sure she fully believed what I'd seen that night, but the next morning she walked outside with me and saw the deep claw marks carved into our front door. She didn't have an explanation for those either. At the very least, she agreed that some kind of large predator had been on our property. From that night forward, everything about our routine changed. We stopped going outside after dark altogether. During the day, life stayed mostly normal. We went to work, ran errands, took care of the property, everything you'd expect. But the second the sun started setting, we were inside with every door locked. I stopped taking the trash out at night and started doing it before leaving for work every morning instead. I even asked my employer if I could switch to an earlier shift, so I'd always make it home before sunset, especially during the winter when it gets dark so early. Thankfully, they approved it. That's basically how we've lived ever since. I wish I had some satisfying explanation to give you, but I don't. It's been 3 years now. Since then, we've found more dead animals scattered around the property, always torn apart in ways that don't look normal. And one of our neighbors disappeared without a trace. Nobody knows what happened to him. Maybe he left town. Maybe something else happened entirely. I have my own suspicions, mostly because I know he liked taking long walks through the woods after dark. I'd warned him more than once that there was a predator around and that he shouldn't be out there alone at night, but he never seemed concerned. Maybe it had nothing to do with his disappearance. Maybe it did. I'll probably never know. What I do know is that whatever I saw standing in those woods wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I've ever known to exist. A couple of summers ago, my girlfriend Emily, my best friend Josh, his girlfriend Megan, and I decided to spend a long weekend camping somewhere that hardly anybody ever went. My uncle had told me about this little lake tucked deep in the Appalachian mountains of eastern Kentucky, surrounded by miles of thick hardwood forest with no houses, no cabins, and no cell service. The only way to reach it was by hiking a narrow trail for about 45 minutes from an old gravel parking area that the Forest Service barely maintained anymore. Most people avoided the place because the hike wasn't easy. There weren't any campsites with amenities, and the lake itself was rumored to be too remote to bother with. That sounded perfect to us. We got there in the late afternoon after the hike in, and the place looked unreal. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the trees that covered every hill around it, and aside from birds and the wind moving through the canopy, there wasn't another sound anywhere. We pitched our tents just above the shoreline, built a fire ring with some old stones we found nearby, and spent the evening grilling hot dogs and drinking a few beers while talking about work, college memories, and all the stupid things we'd done over the years. Nothing crazy, just enough alcohol to relax after the hike. By midnight, we were all exhausted, threw a few more logs on the fire, and crawled into our tents. Sometime during the night, I woke up needing to pee. My head felt a little foggy from the beers, but otherwise I was wide awake. I stepped outside as quietly as I could so I wouldn't wake Emily, walked a few yards away from camp, and while I was standing there, I happened to glance out across the lake. At first I figured I was looking at some animal standing on the opposite shoreline, because I could see what looked like two bright eyes reflecting the moonlight, almost exactly the way a cat's eyes glow when headlights hit them at night. Then I realized something that made my stomach tighten. The eyes weren't staying in one place. They were slowly moving across the water itself. I stared for several seconds, trying to convince myself I was just misjudging the distance. But whatever I was looking at seemed to have a head barely sticking above the surface, and it was moving silently in my direction. Every time I shifted a step, those glowing eyes seemed to stay locked on me. I remember whispering to myself, "There's no way I'm seeing things." Between being half asleep and having a few beers earlier, I convinced myself I was imagining it. I hurried back into the tent, zipped it shut, and just lay there listening to my own heartbeat for what felt like 10 minutes. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to look outside again, and whatever had been there was gone. I laughed it off, figured the alcohol and the darkness had played tricks on my eyes, and somehow managed to fall back asleep. The next morning, I didn't even mention what I'd seen because it sounded ridiculous the more I thought about it. We spent the day hiking around the lake, skipping rocks, taking pictures, and just enjoying how peaceful everything felt. By evening, the temperature was still unusually warm, and Megan suggested we all go swimming before it got completely dark. Emily loved the idea immediately. Josh and I weren't nearly as enthusiastic, but the girls were already laughing as they stripped down to their underwear and waded into the water. They both called back that the lake was surprisingly warm. I told them I'd join them after I got the campfire going. Getting the fire started turned into way more work than I expected. The wood looked dry enough, but every time I thought I had a flame going, it died out again. Josh eventually took over while I kept feeding him smaller sticks. That's when Emily suddenly screamed. At first I thought she was joking around until I looked up and saw her throwing both arms wildly into the air. Megan started yelling that something had grabbed her. Emily disappeared beneath the surface for a second before coming back up, gasping. I took off running without thinking and splashed straight into the lake. By the time I reached her, the water was only around waist deep. She was panicking so badly she couldn't even get words out. I grabbed her by the shoulders and pulled her toward shore. She stumbled away from me, breathing hard, then suddenly turned around and screamed. Before I could even react, I felt something clamp around my right ankle with unbelievable force. It wasn't slippery like a fish. It felt solid, almost like fingers ending in sharp hooks. A stabbing pain shot through my ankle as whatever had me squeezed even harder. I kicked backward as hard as I could with my free leg until I finally felt it let go. I nearly fell getting back onto the shore. Emily was already sitting by one of the coolers, pressing both hands against a deep cut just above her ankle. Blood was running down into the dirt. I looked at my own leg and found an almost identical wound. It wasn't huge, but it was deep enough that blood was pouring out. I grabbed the first aid kit from my backpack, cleaned both cuts as best I could, and wrapped them tightly while everyone kept asking the same question over and over. What in the hell grabbed us? Josh guessed maybe some giant snapping turtle. Megan wondered if it had been an eel somehow. Emily shook her head immediately. She said it didn't feel like teeth or a fish. She said it felt like a hand with claws. The second she said that, I thought about those glowing eyes I'd seen the night before. But I kept my mouth shut, because even I still wasn't sure I believed what I'd seen. We got out of the water and basically collapsed back into camp, all of us scrambling for the first aid kit like it was the only thing keeping us grounded. We moved close to the fire, hands shaking, trying to clean and wrap the cuts before they got any worse. Nobody was really talking at first, just breathing hard and looking at each other, like we were waiting for someone to explain what had just happened. The blood, the adrenaline, the shock of it all, it made everything feel unreal, like the lake had just flipped from peaceful to something else entirely in a matter of seconds. Eventually, we managed to get the bleeding under control and sat back down near the fire, but we were nowhere near calm. We were all in panic, trying to make sense of something that didn't make any sense at all. We didn't know what that thing was, not even close, only that it had grabbed us with real force, like actual hands, not a bite mark, nothing animal we could easily recognize. Josh kept saying it had to be some kind of freak accident, like a beaver or a turtle or something huge that we'd somehow startled. But even he didn't sound convinced. Megan just kept repeating that what she felt wasn't teeth or scales. It was grip, pressure, strength, like something was holding on with intent. Then we heard a splash somewhere out on the lake. Less than a minute later, there was another splash, heavier this time, followed by another. It sounded exactly like someone slowly walking through shallow water. Emily and Megan both wanted to leave right then, but Josh grabbed 2 flashlights and asked me to come with him to see what was making the noise. We walked to the shoreline and swept our lights across the black water. At first, there was nothing except reflections from the trees. Then Josh quietly said, "Don't move." His flashlight stopped on something maybe 40 yards from shore. I aimed mine at the same spot, and my stomach dropped. A head was sticking just above the surface of the lake. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a deer, and it definitely wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. The eyes reflected our flashlights exactly the way I'd seen them the night before, glowing like a cat's in the dark. It didn't blink. It just stared straight at us. Then it slowly rose a little higher out of the water, enough for us to hear another loud splash, as if it had been standing up beneath the surface the whole time. That was enough for both of us. Josh yelled for the girls to grab everything important and forget the rest. We didn't waste another second. We threw our wallets, keys, phones, and backpacks into the truck after the hike back to the parking lot and drove out of those mountains as fast as we could. None of us said much during the drive home. The following afternoon, I went back with my uncle to collect the camping gear we'd abandoned. The tents had been ripped into strips. The coolers were scattered all over the campsite, covered in long, deep scratches, and almost everything we'd left behind was either broken or torn apart. I finally told him everything, including what I'd seen standing by the lake the first night before any of the attacks happened. I even showed him the cut on my ankle. He looked around the lake for a long time without saying anything, before finally admitting he had absolutely no idea what could have done it. We packed up what little was left and left that place for good.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
Everything I'm about to tell you happened only 2 weeks ago, so all of it is still uncomfortably fresh in my mind. I haven't really slept properly since, and there are moments during the day when I catch myself thinking about what I found and immediately feel sick to my stomach. I called the police, of course. An investigation is apparently ongoing, although I don't know if it's going to lead anywhere. The cabin was old, incredibly old, and I have no way of knowing whether what I found there had happened recently or if it had been sitting there for years, waiting for someone to come across it. Either way, I don't think I'll ever be able to look at these mountains the same way again. For some context, I organize hiking trips through the Great Smoky Mountains, and other parts of Appalachia. Most of my clients are people who love the outdoors, but don't feel comfortable exploring remote mountain areas on their own. Over the years, I've also built a decent following online because I have a strange fascination with the stories that come out of these mountains. Some of them are supernatural legends. Others are true crime cases, disappearances, local folklore, abandoned communities, and strange encounters that people swear happened to them. Whether I believe all of it isn't really the point. I just enjoy the stories and the history behind them. A lot of my marketing actually revolves around that sense of unease that Appalachia seems to naturally create. I take people to old settlements, forgotten cemeteries, and places where tragedies happened decades ago. I tell stories around campfires and while we're hiking through the woods. People enjoy feeling unsettled in a safe environment. They want that creeping sensation that maybe there's something watching them from the trees, even when they know there isn't. I always try to do it respectfully, though. If something terrible happened recently and families are still grieving, I leave it alone. Some things aren't entertainment. But old stories and local legends are different, and exploring them has become both my job and my favorite thing in the world. This particular trip wasn't for clients. I was alone because I wanted to investigate a location I'd read about online. A guy on Reddit had posted about an abandoned cabin somewhere in the Smokies. I ended up reaching out to him privately, and he gave me a rough location. According to him, he had been camping nearby and woke up in the middle of the night because he heard somebody screaming. Not shouting and not talking, but screaming. He said it sounded like someone was in absolute agony. He didn't even know the cabin existed at first. He only discovered it because he followed the sound through the trees. He eventually realized the screams were coming from inside the cabin itself. The problem was that the cabin was supposed to have been abandoned for years. He didn't investigate any further. He was alone, unarmed, and deep in the mountains. Instead, he packed his gear and left before sunrise. The one thing that stuck with me was that he never called the police. I remember reading that message and feeling irritated with him. If there's even a small chance that someone is genuinely in distress, you call somebody. You don't need to play hero or put yourself in danger, but at least make the call. That's the minimum amount of responsibility we owe each other. The story got my attention because another post from years earlier described the same cabin as one of the supposedly haunted locations hidden in that area of the Smokies. I figured there was probably a rational explanation for everything. Maybe local kids were messing around. Maybe there were squatters living inside. Maybe the Reddit guy had heard an animal and let his imagination fill in the blanks. Regardless, it sounded interesting enough that I decided to check it out. I deliberately parked farther away than I needed to. There was actually an old service road that would have put me within a day's hike of the location, but part of my job involves understanding these places properly. I like learning how long it realistically takes to reach somewhere, how difficult the terrain is, and whether it's practical for future trips. So I took the longer route. After about 2.5 days of hiking, I finally reached the area. The cabin sat among the trees on a slight rise overlooking a narrow clearing. It wasn't especially large, and if nobody had told me it was there, I probably would have walked right past it. The wood had darkened with age. Parts of the roof had partially collapsed, and several windows were boarded over. It looked like every abandoned structure you imagine finding deep in the mountains. Except there was something about it that immediately made me uncomfortable. I can't explain why. I set up my tent a reasonable distance away because I didn't particularly like the idea of sleeping next to an abandoned building in the middle of nowhere. I laughed at myself while I was doing it because I spend a huge portion of my life telling scary stories in these mountains. I've camped beside abandoned mines, old churches, and places where murders happened. I've heard every ghost story Appalachia has to offer. Nothing has ever bothered me. But that cabin did. I spent maybe an hour sitting by my camp stove, eating dinner and occasionally glancing over at it. Every time I looked in that direction, I had this strange feeling that I shouldn't be there. It wasn't fear exactly. It felt more primitive than that. The closest thing I can compare it to is the instinct you get when you accidentally walk too close to the edge of a cliff. Your body suddenly becomes aware of danger before your mind has identified any actual threat. Eventually, I climbed into my tent and tried to sleep. But I couldn't. I kept staring at the fabric wall nearest the cabin. I remember checking my phone repeatedly, trying to distract myself. I even laughed once because I realized how ridiculous I was being. I was a grown adult who literally made a living exploring creepy places, and an abandoned cabin was somehow making me feel like a nervous kid. Around 2 a.m, I finally gave up. I got out of my tent, packed everything back into my backpack, and moved camp. I didn't move a few feet. I moved as far away from that cabin as I reasonably could. I've never done anything like that before in my life. I have slept in places where people claimed they saw ghosts, heard voices, or witnessed all kinds of bizarre things. I've never once felt an overwhelming need to leave. But that night, I did. It felt like every instinct I had was telling me to put distance between myself and that building. The next morning, with sunlight filtering through the trees and birds making noise again, I felt stupid. Everything looked normal. The cabin looked old and abandoned and completely harmless. Part of me considered just hiking back and forgetting the whole thing, but this was literally the reason I'd come all that way. I hadn't heard any screams during the night. Nothing strange had happened. I convinced myself I had simply let the stories get into my head. So I walked back to the cabin. One of the windows had already been broken, probably years earlier, and I climbed through it. Even during the daytime, I still needed my flashlight because most of the windows had been boarded shut from the inside. The interior smelled like damp wood and old dust. Furniture was scattered everywhere. Some of it had collapsed. Other pieces looked like they had been moved around by people exploring the place over the years. Graffiti covered one wall. A few drawers had been pulled out and left open. At first, it was honestly disappointing. It was just an old cabin. The objects inside looked ancient. Some of them were probably close to a century old. There was nothing unusual about any of it. Then I noticed the Bible. It was sitting in the middle of a table, and it was open. Everything else in the room was covered in a layer of dust. The table was dusty. The chairs were dusty. The floor was dusty. But the Bible wasn't. Not a single speck. It looked like somebody had placed it there recently. I was standing there in complete silence, staring at it with my flashlight in one hand, and wondering why someone would come all the way out into the middle of the Smoky Mountains just to leave a perfectly clean Bible inside an abandoned cabin. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe somebody had been there a few days earlier and left it behind. But for some reason, looking at that untouched Bible in the center of that room made me feel exactly the same way I had felt the night before, like I shouldn't be there. I tried to put the Bible out of my mind and just kept exploring the cabin. At that point, I was almost ready to leave. I'd been inside for a while, and apart from that one detail, there was nothing particularly unusual about the place. It was exactly what you'd expect from an abandoned structure deep in the Smokies. Old furniture, broken dishes, a few items that had clearly been left behind decades ago. I was actually feeling a little disappointed because I had come all that way expecting to at least understand why people were so disturbed by this place. Then I noticed something near the back of the cabin. There was an old wardrobe pushed against the wall. It looked like it was one good push away from collapsing. The wood had warped with age, and parts of it were dark and soft from moisture. What caught my attention wasn't the wardrobe itself, though. It was the floor beneath it. When I pointed my flashlight down, I could clearly see marks in the wood. The cabinet had been dragged at some point. There were scrape marks leading toward it, and just like the Bible, there seemed to be less dust around that area. It wasn't spotless by any means, but it looked disturbed, like somebody had moved it relatively recently. I don't know why, but the second I noticed that, my stomach tightened. I walked over to it and just stood there for a few seconds, staring at this rotten piece of furniture. Then I grabbed one side and pulled. The best way I can describe what happened next is that it felt like walking straight into an invisible wall. I know how ridiculous that sounds. I don't mean I physically hit something. I mean it felt like a shock ran through my entire body. Every hair on my arm stood up. My chest tightened. Behind the wardrobe was a door, and I had this overwhelming instinct telling me not to open it. Not nervousness, not curiosity. It was something much more primitive than that. It was the same feeling I'd had the night before when I suddenly felt the need to move my tent farther away from the cabin. Every part of me was screaming that whatever was behind that door wasn't something I wanted to see. The problem was that I had come all the way out there specifically to investigate this place. So I opened it. I didn't even have to force it. The door wasn't locked. And nothing could have prepared me for what was on the other side. The smell hit me first. It was one of the worst things I've ever smelled in my life. Thick, pungent, almost sweet in the way rotting things sometimes are. I actually recoiled and put my hand over my mouth. The room itself was small, almost like a storage space that had been closed off from the rest of the cabin. In one corner was a mattress. Calling it a bed almost feels wrong. It was filthy beyond description. The fabric was stained and darkened, and the blanket on top looked like it had been there for years. Beside it sat a plastic basin containing some kind of dark liquid and other things I couldn't identify because it was covered in flies. I remember immediately thinking that somebody had been using it as a toilet. Then I looked at the walls. Every single wall in that room was covered in scratches, thousands of them. Some were long and deep, others looked shallow and frantic. They weren't random marks in the wood. They looked like somebody had repeatedly clawed at the walls with their fingernails. In several places, the scratches were darkened by something that had dried into the grain. Even now, I don't want to say with certainty what it was, but standing there wasn't really another explanation that made sense to me. I remember feeling completely numb. I wasn't scared, and I wasn't even thinking clearly. I just stood there looking around that room, and this overwhelming sadness hit me all at once. I don't know who had been in there. I don't know for how long. I don't know if they survived whatever happened to them. But every single thing about that room suggested suffering on a level I don't even know how to put into words. I almost felt like I was grieving somebody I had never met. The whole place had this unbearable sense of despair to it. Like somebody had spent a very long time in that room wanting to get out. I don't know how long I stood there, maybe 30 seconds, maybe several minutes. It felt longer. Eventually, my brain seemed to start working again. I backed out of the room, closed the door, pushed myself away from the cabin. Then I took out my satellite phone and called for help. A couple of park rangers reached me first. I explained everything and brought them back to the cabin. On the way there, one of them mentioned that they had received reports about the place before. Apparently, people had occasionally claimed to hear noises coming from the cabin. Some had reported voices. Others had described screams. He said they had investigated several times and never found anything. I didn't say anything. I simply opened the hidden door and stepped aside. The expressions on their faces changed immediately. I knew right then they had never found that room. Both of them went completely pale. One of them actually stopped in the doorway and just stared inside without speaking. The other took a step forward, looked around for maybe 3 seconds, then turned around and walked back outside. I think seeing their reaction affected me almost as much as seeing the room itself. Up until then, a part of me was still trying to convince myself there was some explanation I wasn't seeing. Watching two people whose job involves searching remote wilderness areas react like that made me realize I wasn't overreacting. They immediately called the police and explained that there was what appeared to be a concealed room inside the cabin and that it could potentially be a crime scene. They were particularly disturbed by the marks on the walls because some of them looked much newer than everything else inside that cabin. As far as I know, the entire area is currently closed off. The trail leading to the cabin has been blocked, and investigators have been in and out of the site since then. I still don't know anything else. That's the part that's driving me insane. There are no answers. I keep thinking about that room. I think about it while I'm driving. I think about it when I'm trying to sleep. I think about somebody lying on that mattress and scratching those walls until their fingers bled. Sometimes it gets to me more than I'd like to admit. The only people I've really talked to about it are my family and a few friends who occasionally come on these trips with me. There are places in Appalachia where I don't like going alone. Not because I'm particularly fearful, but because these mountains are isolated enough that if something goes wrong, it can go very wrong. I'm a fairly big guy, and I've spent most of my life outdoors, but there are moments when you realize confidence can create a false sense of security. All of them were horrified when I described what I had found, and honestly, I think that's what has stayed with me more than anything else. The realization that there are probably countless places like that scattered throughout these mountains. Cabins, sheds, hunting camps, abandoned homes that nobody checks and nobody thinks about anymore. It makes me wonder how many others like this exist. It makes me wonder how many terrible things happen in places so isolated that the rest of the world never even realizes they happened. I think that's the part that keeps me awake. The fact that somebody could suffer like that, somewhere deep in these mountains, and for a very long time, nobody knew they were there. This all happened very recently, only a couple of weeks ago, so it's all still sitting right there in my head. I don't even know why I'm telling this story. Maybe because I don't know what else to do with it. This isn't the kind of thing I've ever had to process before, and part of me is still worried that whatever happened out there could still be happening to someone else. For some context, I live in California now, in a busy part of the city where there's always traffic outside, and you can hear people at almost any hour of the day. I grew up in West Virginia, though, and some of my best memories are of hiking with my parents and grandparents through the mountains. Then I moved away, got caught up in work and adult life, and little by little, I lost that connection to nature. I still went back occasionally for a hike, but each year it happened less often than the year before. About 4 months ago, I moved in with my girlfriend, Katie. We'd been together for around a year and decided it made sense to get a place together. Things between us are great. We have a healthy relationship and communicate well. But anyone who's ever moved in with a partner knows there's a delicate adjustment period at first. You're learning each other's habits, routines, and personal space, especially when both people have spent years living alone and answering only to themselves. To break up the routine a little, and if I'm being completely honest, because I wanted to impress her, I suggested we go camping in West Virginia. I'd done it countless times before, but Katie had never been camping in her life. Looking back now, I think the mountains of West Virginia may have been a bit much for someone's first experience. The plan was simple. We'd spend 4 days hiking and camping before heading back home. Because it was only supposed to be a short trip, we didn't tell her parents where we were going. Her father, especially, can be extremely overprotective, and both of her parents have a habit of checking in constantly to make sure everything is okay. We did tell my parents where we'd be, though, and we also let one of our friends know our general route and roughly when we expected to return. I think that's just common sense whenever you're heading into the mountains. Even if you're confident in your abilities, someone should always know where you are. The first day went perfectly. Katie loved it far more than I expected she would. She was nervous at first because she'd never experienced darkness like that before. The woods in West Virginia get unbelievably dark at night. There are places where you can't see your own hand in front of your face, and if you're not used to it, that kind of darkness can feel almost oppressive. Then there are all the sounds, branches creaking, leaves moving, animals you can't see making noises somewhere in the trees. It's easy for someone unfamiliar with that environment to feel intimidated. Even so, we weren't completely isolated on that first night. We knew we could reach civilization relatively quickly if something went wrong, and that seemed to reassure her. The second day was supposed to take us farther into the mountains. Everything was fine until around 4 in the afternoon, when it suddenly started pouring rain. We checked the weather forecast before leaving, and every single day had shown sunshine. But mountain weather doesn't always care about forecasts. Within minutes, it was raining so hard that we were completely soaked. The trail became muddy almost immediately, and water was beginning to run down parts of it like tiny streams. We weren't prepared for that kind of weather at all. Instead of continuing toward the area where we'd planned to camp, we decided to look for some kind of temporary shelter. There are old structures scattered throughout parts of those mountains, and every now and then you'll come across a place where hikers can at least get out of the rain. It must have been about an hour after the storm started, when we were both drenched, cold, and more than a little irritated by the whole situation, that we found the cabin. It was obviously abandoned. The structure was old, the windows were dark, and the entire place had that strange look that buildings develop when they've been left alone for years. Neither of us wanted to go inside. That wasn't the plan. But the rain was coming down so heavily that we didn't have many options. As it turned out, getting inside wasn't difficult. One of the downstairs windows had already been broken, which meant someone had probably used the place before us for exactly the same reason. Inside, there wasn't anything particularly strange, at least not at first. The cabin simply felt abandoned. The air was stale, and there was dust everywhere, but the structure itself seemed solid enough. It didn't look like it was about to collapse on top of us. Since the ground outside had become completely saturated and there were puddles forming everywhere, we decided we'd probably spend the night there and continue in the morning. We laid out our sleeping bags, rigged up a small tarp above us as an extra layer of protection from the occasional leak in the roof, and did our best to dry our clothes and switch into whatever dry things we still had left in our packs. Even our backpacks had gotten wet, so neither of us was particularly comfortable. At some point we fell asleep. I don't know how much time had passed when Katie suddenly woke me up. She told me she'd heard what sounded like a child. I can't explain why the way she said it made every hair on my arm stand up, but it did. I could tell she wasn't joking, and she wasn't confused. Katie isn't dramatic. She doesn't exaggerate things, and she certainly doesn't invent things for attention. If she says she heard something, then she heard something. She explained that she'd woken up because she thought she could hear a child laughing. I remember immediately looking toward the broken window. Rain was still falling heavily outside, and I couldn't see anything at all. I asked her whether she thought maybe she'd been dreaming. She admitted that maybe she had. She said it had felt incredibly real, but maybe she'd simply been half asleep. Since we were both awake at that point, and a little unsettled by the idea of hearing a child in the middle of nowhere, we stayed awake for a while longer before eventually drifting back to sleep. Then I woke up to the sound of a child laughing. I know I wasn't dreaming because I woke in the middle of the sound itself. It wasn't faint. It wasn't distant. The laugh seemed close enough that, for a split second, I had the bizarre sensation that there was another person in the room with us. I was already turning toward Katie to tell her I'd heard it too when it happened again. Both of us froze. Neither of us said anything. We simply listened. There was absolutely no possibility that a child should have been there with us, in that cabin, that far into the mountains, in the middle of a storm and long after dark. Neither of us knew exactly what we were hearing. All I know is that every instinct I had suddenly began screaming at me to leave. I felt it so strongly that I didn't even question it. We grabbed our essentials, left the tarp behind, didn't bother packing properly, and walked right out of that cabin into the pouring rain. That's probably the part that says the most about how unsettling it was. The conditions outside were terrible. It was still raining hard, it was dark, and we had no business hiking in the middle of the night. Yet, both of us would rather have been out there in the storm than remain inside that cabin for another minute. We spent the rest of the night walking with only a rough sense of direction. Neither of us really knew where we were going. I had a general idea of where we needed to head, and fortunately, it turned out to be the right direction. By sunrise, we were close to the area where we'd camped the previous night, and by around lunchtime, we'd made it back to the car and left. We've talked about it a lot since then. Neither of us knows what we heard. All we know is that, despite sounding like a child laughing, there was no reasonable way for a child to have been there with us. And more than that, there was something about the sound itself that didn't feel natural. I know how ridiculous that sounds. I'm not a spiritual person. I don't believe in the supernatural. Katie doesn't either. At most, she believes in astrology, and that's about where it ends. But both of us came away from that mountain with exactly the same feeling. Whatever laughed in that cabin that night, it wasn't a child. As if all of that somehow hadn't already been frightening enough. And believe me when I say that it was. This is the part where I stop having any kind of explanation and start feeling genuinely afraid. 2 weeks passed. Katie and I went back home and gradually slipped into our normal routines again. We still talked about what happened in that cabin fairly often because it had shaken both of us more than either of us wanted to admit. But we were trying to move on from it. We kept attempting to rationalize it. Maybe we'd heard some kind of animal. Maybe the acoustics inside the cabin had distorted another sound. Maybe we'd both been exhausted and already on edge from being stranded in the middle of a storm. The human brain can do strange things under stress, and I think we both wanted there to be an explanation, even if we couldn't quite figure out what it was. Then, 2 nights ago, something happened that I still don't know how to process. I woke up to exactly the same laugh. And I know it wasn't a dream. I wasn't fully asleep. I had stayed up late reading in bed because I'd been enjoying a book and wanted to finish a few more chapters. Katie had fallen asleep around 3 hours earlier, and I remember eventually putting the book down and drifting into that strange state where you're not completely awake, but not truly asleep either. I couldn't have been out for more than 10 or 20 minutes. Then I heard it. I sat upright so fast that my chest hurt. It was 4 a.m, and I heard a child laughing. The sound was identical to what we had heard in that cabin. I know how ridiculous that sentence sounds, but I would swear under oath that it was the same laugh, the same pitch, the same strange rhythm to it. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't distant either. It sounded as though it had come from somewhere downstairs, from inside our house. I sat there without moving. Every muscle in my body had gone rigid. I remember staring into the darkness of our bedroom and feeling my pulse pounding in my neck. Beside me, Katie was still asleep. She hadn't moved. I considered waking her up immediately, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I didn't want to tell her that I thought I'd just heard the same thing that had driven us out of an abandoned cabin in the middle of the night. I didn't want to watch her become frightened all over again, especially if there was still some explanation I hadn't considered. The laugh didn't happen a second time. The house stayed completely silent. I don't know how long I sat there. It might have been 10 minutes. It might have been an hour. I never looked at the clock again. I just listened and waited for it to happen one more time. It never did. Eventually, I got up and checked the entire house. Every room, every closet, every door and window, but there was nothing there. I went back upstairs and lay in bed until morning without sleeping for another second. The reason I'm telling this story is because I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. I don't believe in ghosts. I've never followed paranormal stories. I don't know anyone who's experienced anything like this. And I've never been interested in this kind of thing beyond listening to the occasional creepy story online. But I know what I heard in that cabin, and I know what I heard in my house. I'm afraid mostly because I have no framework for any of this. I don't know whether the two things are connected. I don't know whether stress and lack of sleep are affecting me more than I realize. I don't know whether I'm overthinking something that has a perfectly ordinary explanation. I just know that when I heard that laugh downstairs at 4 a.m, my first thought wasn't that there was a child in the house. My first thought was that whatever was in that cabin might have followed us home.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
I live in one of the most remote parts of West Virginia, tucked deep into the mountains where the nearest town is almost 40 minutes away, and the closest neighbor lives well beyond the tree line. My cabin sits at the end of an old gravel road that winds through miles of dense forest before finally reaching my property. There are no streetlights out there, no traffic, no sounds of civilization after dark. Most nights, the only things I hear are crickets, distant coyotes, and the wind moving through the trees. I moved there 3 years ago after burning out from city life. I had spent most of my 20s chasing business opportunities that never really went anywhere. Meanwhile, my older brother seemed to succeed at everything he touched. He owned a thriving construction company, had a nice house, and seemed to have his entire future mapped out. I wasn't jealous of him, but I couldn't help comparing my life to his. Moving into an isolated cabin in the mountains wasn't exactly where I imagined I'd end up at 31 years old. Still, I grew to love the solitude. The cabin wasn't much, but it was mine. It sat on nearly 20 acres of heavily wooded land, surrounded by steep hills and thick forest. Once the sun went down, the darkness outside became almost absolute. On moonless nights, you couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the porch. This happened late last November. A powerful storm system had rolled across the state that evening. The weather forecast had warned of heavy rain and strong winds. But forecasts rarely prepared you for what those storms actually felt like out there. By 10 o'clock, rain was hammering against the roof so hard it sounded like gravel being thrown from the sky. The trees surrounding the cabin swayed violently with each gust, and every so often, a flash of lightning would briefly illuminate the forest before plunging everything back into darkness. I had spent most of the evening sitting in my living room with a blanket, watching an old movie and listening to the storm rage outside. There was something comforting about being warm and dry while nature lost its mind around you. Shortly after midnight, the power went out. The television clicked off instantly, leaving me in complete darkness. I sighed, grabbed my phone from the coffee table, and turned on the flashlight. Power outages weren't uncommon where I lived. Usually they lasted a few hours before crews managed to restore service. I wasn't particularly worried. I figured I'd head to bed and deal with it in the morning. But about 10 minutes later, while I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom, I heard a loud metallic bang somewhere outside. At first, I assumed something had blown into the side of the cabin. During storms like that, fallen branches were common. I was worried that once again there might be damage done to my cabin, but I wasn't scared until I heard it again. This time, it sounded deliberate. I turned off the faucet and listened. The storm continued howling outside, but beneath it I heard something else. There was a rhythm in the noise, but with everything that was happening, I couldn't clearly make out exactly what it was. It seemed to be coming from outside, and from the front of the cabin, maybe from the porch. I moved closer to the window, and as I did, a horrible feeling came over me. I think what I was hearing were someone's footsteps, but nobody should have been out there. The nearest gas station was over 20 miles away, and almost nobody even knew where my property was located. I slowly walked toward the front window and carefully pulled back the curtain. At first I saw nothing except rain. Then lightning flashed. For less than a second, I saw a figure standing at the edge of my porch. The moment darkness returned, the figure was gone. I immediately stepped away from the window. My heart was pounding really fast now. I told myself there was probably a reasonable explanation. Maybe someone's vehicle had broken down on the road. Maybe they needed help. But even as I tried to rationalize it, something felt wrong. People who need help knock on the door. They don't stand silently outside your house in the middle of a storm. I quietly locked the bedroom door and checked my phone. No signal. That wasn't unusual during bad weather, but it was enough to make my stomach drop a bit. Then I heard something that completely erased any doubt that I was in danger. The sound of a door being crushed, then footsteps from inside my cabin. I stood completely still, partly because I was in absolute panic and my body refused to react. And for a few seconds, all I could hear was my own heartbeat. Then came the unmistakable sound of wet boots moving across the wooden floor. Someone had clearly entered my house. Actually, judging by the multiple sets of footsteps, several people had. I slowly grabbed the rifle I kept locked in a cabinet beside my bed. I wasn't looking for a confrontation, but I wasn't about to sit defenseless while strangers wandered through my home. The footsteps moved through the living room. Cabinets opened. Drawers slid out. They weren't being quiet. They acted like they knew nobody would stop them. Then I heard voices. It sounded like at least 3 men, maybe 4. Their words were muffled, but I could tell they were communicating with each other. One of them laughed, and that sound still makes my skin crawl. There was something deeply unsettling about how comfortable they seemed, as if they had done this before, as if they weren't worried about being caught. I carefully cracked open my bedroom door and looked down the hallway. The power outage had left the cabin pitch black, but occasional flashes of lightning lit up portions of the house through the windows. During one of those flashes, I saw them. 3 men wearing dark rain jackets. One carried a flashlight, another appeared to be carrying a crowbar. The third was standing near my kitchen, looking directly toward the hallway. I instantly pulled the door shut. A second later, I heard footsteps moving in my direction. I didn't wait. The back of my cabin had a small utility door leading outside. I threw it open and ran into the storm. Rain hit me like a wall. The ground was already turning to mud beneath my boots, and it was hard to keep my balance between the absolute darkness and the uneven ground. I sprinted through the darkness toward an old logging trail that crossed my property. Branches slapped my face and water soaked my clothes within seconds. Several times I nearly fell down the steep hillside. Behind me, I could hear shouting. They had realized I was gone. For nearly 15 minutes, I ran through the woods with no real destination in mind. I just needed distance between myself and the cabin. Finally, after climbing onto higher ground, my phone picked up a weak signal, and I immediately called 911. The dispatcher kept telling me to stay calm while deputies were sent to the property, but it took almost 40 minutes for law enforcement to reach the area. That's the reality of living somewhere that remote. By the time they arrived, the intruders were gone. The front door had been forced open. Several firearms, cash, tools, and electronics had been stolen. The deputies believed the men had probably been watching the property for some time. They likely knew I lived alone and waited for the storm and power outage to provide cover. As you can imagine, I didn't go back to living in that cabin for months. My brother let me stay with him. But eventually, I had to return, and even today, I still live in this cabin. Most nights are peaceful, but whenever a storm rolls through the mountains and the power flickers, I find myself staring into the darkness beyond the windows, wondering whether someone might be standing out there again, watching from the trees. Meanwhile, I have a much safer cabin than I did back then. It's no longer so easy to break down the front door. I built a tunnel under the cabin that cost me a fortune, but it allows me to escape if someone breaks in, or to wait in a safe, impenetrable place until the police arrive. I hope nothing like that ever happens again, because once was traumatic enough. But if it does happen, they won't catch me unprepared. My name is Dean, and everything I'm about to tell you happened maybe around 7 years ago. It was easily the most traumatic period of my life, and honestly, I don't think I've managed to connect all the dots even now. I needed years before I could feel remotely comfortable living in these mountains again, and even today, I wouldn't say I'm completely at ease. There are still nights when I hear something outside, or catch myself staring into the woods longer than I should, and my mind goes right back to that time. For a little context, I grew up in West Virginia, and I've spent almost my entire life out here. Isolation was never something that bothered me because it's all I ever knew. My parents owned a huge piece of land that sat completely by itself. No nearby neighbors, no traffic, no kids my age running around. I pretty much grew up alone. I entertained myself with whatever I could find and didn't have much interaction with other people outside of my family. Because of that, I never developed any fear of being by myself or living somewhere remote. If anything, I became more comfortable with solitude than I ever was around crowds. The only time in my life that I really stepped away from that was when I turned 18. I went through a rebellious phase and convinced myself I needed to get out of West Virginia. To me, it felt like a place with nothing to offer someone my age, especially somebody who never went to college. I looked around and couldn't see opportunities, couldn't see a future, and honestly couldn't imagine myself staying there forever. So, I left and ended up in California. I lived there for about 3 years. Then I came back. I came back for 2 reasons. The first one sounds stupid unless you've spent your life in places like these. I was starting to feel suffocated by being around people all the time. I don't know how else to explain it. It was almost like the mountains were calling me back. I missed the quiet. I missed being able to step outside at night and hear absolutely nothing. I missed the feeling of space and the kind of peace that only comes from knowing you're completely alone. The second reason was much less poetic. I was broke. I quit my job because I was being completely taken advantage of, like a lot of people are these days. I couldn't take it anymore. I figured I'd find something else quickly, but that didn't happen. Before I knew it, I had burned through most of my savings and didn't have many options left. Moving back to West Virginia became less of a choice and more of a necessity. The funny thing is that I didn't even resent it. By that point, I already felt like I needed to come back anyway. My parents owned a cabin that they mostly used as a vacation place. They let me move in there instead of going back to live with them, which I appreciated more than I can explain. The cabin sat deep in the mountains, far enough away from everything that nights were genuinely dark, and the nearest neighbors might as well have been on another planet. And honestly, life was pretty good. Over the next 4 years, I built a comfortable routine for myself. I found a job that I actually didn't mind and that paid me well enough. I never had expensive tastes. My biggest expenses were maintaining the cabin and keeping up with the property. Out here, there honestly isn't much to spend money on anyway. I kept to myself, went to work, came home, and spent most evenings enjoying the peace and quiet. For 4 years, everything was fine. Then one night, I had an absolutely miserable day at work and found myself in one of those weird moods where you feel emotionally exhausted and start craving comfort food for no reason. I didn't really have anything at home, and I figured getting out of the cabin for a little while might help pull me out of whatever funk I had fallen into. There's a small gas station and convenience store about 15 minutes from my place. Because it's close to one of the main roads cutting through the mountains, it gets a surprising amount of traffic. The owner and his wife make homemade desserts that are ridiculously good, and for some reason, that's all I could think about that night. So I got in my truck and drove there. I knew the guy behind the counter pretty well by then, and we ended up chatting for a while. He asked how work was going, I complained about my day, and it was honestly just a completely normal conversation. Then another man walked in. He sat next to me and naturally joined the conversation. At first he seemed perfectly pleasant, one of those people who can talk to anyone within 5 minutes of meeting them. He was friendly, funny, and honestly pretty easy to talk to. I didn't get a bad feeling from him at all. If anything, I remember thinking he seemed interesting. Then at one point, he touched my arm. It wasn't anything aggressive. It just felt different. A little later, he said something that made it pretty clear he was flirting with me. I explained as politely as I could that I wasn't interested and that I didn't date men. I even told him I had a girlfriend, which wasn't true, but it seemed easier than potentially making things awkward. I wasn't offended or uncomfortable. I'm not remotely judgmental about that kind of thing. What happens between consenting adults is their business. And there are far bigger things to worry about in this country than who somebody happens to be attracted to. So, I kept the whole thing as casual as possible. The problem was that he didn't really seem to understand what I was saying. Throughout the rest of the evening, he kept making comments that forced me to repeat myself more than once. I remember eventually laughing a little and saying something like, "Look, I really think you're interested in me. And honestly, I'm flattered, but I'm straight. I'm just not into guys." Again, I tried to keep the tone light. Eventually, I decided it was time to leave. Before I got up, he asked if he could have my phone number and maybe keep in touch. I have always been terrible at telling people no. It's seriously one of my biggest flaws. So, I hesitated, but still said yes. I also immediately decided there was no way I was giving him my actual number. I ended up giving him the number from an old phone I used to have years before, one that had long since been disconnected. If he ever tried calling it, there wouldn't be anyone on the other end. I made an excuse about needing to get home, told him maybe we'd grab coffee sometime, and left as quickly as I reasonably could. I never told him where I lived, never mentioned my cabin, never talked about the road I took home. Nothing. And this next part is important. The drive back to my cabin takes about 15 minutes and cuts through an incredibly isolated section of mountain road. There are no streetlights, no houses, nothing. If another vehicle had followed me, I would have seen it immediately. There simply isn't any way not to. That night, nobody followed me home. At least, that's what I believed. 4 days later, I woke up in the middle of the night because I heard something inside my house. At first, I honestly thought it was the neighborhood cat. There's this orange cat that hangs around my property all the time. I've tried more than once to bring him inside permanently because this area is full of predators. I live way out in the woods, the kind of place where hearing coyotes at night isn't unusual and where you occasionally see bear tracks near the edge of your property. I always felt bad for him being out there alone. I leave food and water outside every day, and in a weird way, I've kind of adopted him, even if he clearly doesn't see things that way. He'll come inside sometimes if the windows are open, wander around for a bit, and then leave again. The second he realizes he's trapped indoors, though, he completely panics until I open everything back up. So when I woke up to the noise that night, I didn't feel afraid. If anything, I was mildly annoyed. I figured he'd gotten inside again and knocked something over. I got out of bed with the sole intention of opening a window or a door so he could leave. Then I started walking downstairs. I remember being halfway down the staircase when I looked toward the living room and immediately froze. One of the windows was wide open, and there was a man climbing out of it. The second he saw me, he moved faster. He practically launched himself through the window, landed outside, and disappeared into the woods. I don't think I've ever gone from half asleep to fully awake that quickly in my entire life. I just stood there for several seconds. Nothing made sense. Since moving there, I'd never had anyone try to break into my house. I'd never been robbed. I'd never even had someone accidentally pull into my driveway because it's that isolated. You're tucked so deep into the mountains that people don't simply end up there by mistake. What terrified me wasn't losing property. It was the realization that someone had been inside my house while I was asleep. I turned on every light in the place, every single one. I checked every room, every closet, every window, every door. I expected to find something missing. My wallet, my laptop, my television, anything. Nothing was gone. I called the police immediately. They arrived, searched around the property, took my statement, and looked through the house. I remember telling them I was almost certain I had locked everything before going to bed because I'm obsessive about checking doors and windows at night. Still, I gave myself room to doubt it. Maybe I'd forgotten a window. Maybe I'd been distracted. Maybe I was remembering incorrectly. The officers told me to contact them if I realized anything had been stolen. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. The real nightmare started the following night. It was around 1 in the morning. I'd been downstairs playing video games for a while because I couldn't relax enough to go to sleep. Eventually, I got tired, turned everything off, and headed upstairs. I pulled back my blankets, and there was a photograph lying on my bed. It was a picture of me sleeping. I knew instantly it had been taken the previous night. I was wearing the same t-shirt I'd slept in after making dinner. I'd accidentally spilled tomato sauce on it earlier that evening and had simply wiped it off with a paper towel because I was too lazy to change. I remember thinking I'd wash it in the morning. The stain was visible in the photograph. I cannot properly explain the feeling that went through my body. It was like every muscle suddenly stopped working. The man hadn't entered my house to steal anything. He had stood next to my bed while I slept. He had taken a picture of me, and then he had left it there for me to find. I don't even know how I didn't wake up. I didn't sleep that night. I called the police again and handed over the photograph. Given everything that had happened, they agreed to keep a patrol car occasionally checking the area during the overnight hours. For almost 2.5 months, nothing happened. Then I came home from work one afternoon and found another photograph taped to my front door. Again, it was a picture of me sleeping. I didn't know when it had been taken, but it seemed recent because I'd gotten a new haircut only a few weeks earlier. Written across the photograph were words asking if I had missed him. I felt this wave of cold run straight through me. I looked around the property. I looked toward the tree line. But there was nothing. I immediately went inside, locked everything, and called the police. That same day, I finally did what my father had been telling me to do for years. I bought security cameras. I installed them everywhere. I also changed every lock in the house because by then I had started wondering whether this person somehow had a key. There was never any sign of forced entry. No broken windows, no damaged doors, nothing. I started sleeping less and less. Days would go by and I'd convince myself it was over. Then another photograph would appear. Always me sleeping. Always recent. I can't properly describe how psychologically exhausting that became. I barely slept. Every creak in the house made me jump. Every sound outside sent me to the windows. Friends started staying over because I couldn't stand being alone anymore. Nothing ever happened when someone else was there, only when I was by myself. And it was almost always after several sleepless nights, when I was so exhausted that I'd finally crash. What puzzled me the most was that I spent hours of my life watching the cameras, and not once did any of them capture someone on screen. In one of the recordings, I think I can see a shadow of someone walking at the edge of the frame, but I'm not completely sure. Eventually, I moved back in with my parents for a while because I genuinely thought I was losing my mind. Then I woke up there one morning and found another photograph of myself sleeping. I don't think I've ever felt fear like that, because at that point, it didn't matter where I went. Whoever this person was could find me anywhere. Eventually, I snapped. One night, I decided I wasn't going to sleep. I left something else in my bed under the blankets and pretended I had gone to sleep. I sat in the darkness and waited. I don't know how many hours passed, but then I saw him. He walked into my room as if he belonged there. I remember every hair on my body standing up. He didn't move like a burglar. He wasn't in a hurry, and he wasn't nervous. He simply stood beside my bed and watched. Then he leaned over to take another picture and finally realized the thing in the bed wasn't me. He turned around, and for the first time, I saw his face. I recognized him immediately. It was the man from the gas station. The man I'd met months earlier while buying dessert. The man I'd politely rejected. He looked furious, and then he ran. Honestly, by then, I wasn't afraid anymore. I was angry. That man had stolen months of my life. He'd made me afraid to sleep, afraid to be alone, afraid inside my own home. So I chased him outside. I caught up to him as he was climbing over my fence. I fired one shot and hit him in the foot. I had absolutely no intention of killing him. I wanted him to stop. I wanted him to know that I wasn't going to spend another night living in terror because of him. And apparently it worked. That was 7 years ago. I've never received another photograph. I've never found another note, and I've never seen him again. I still don't know who he really was. I don't know how he found my house, how he kept getting inside, or why he became so obsessively fixated on me after one brief interaction at a gas station. All I know is that a complete stranger managed to steal years of peace from my life. And even now, 7 years later, I still double-check my doors before going to bed. I still look at my bedroom window sometimes before turning off the lights. And every once in a while, when I wake up suddenly in the middle of the night, there's still this brief moment where I expect to find another photograph waiting for me.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
About 5 years ago, something happened that I still think about all the time, especially whenever people start talking about complicated family situations, old grudges, or the kind of secrets that seem to sit inside families for generations without ever really being talked about. It was one of the strangest and most unsettling periods of my life. And even now, looking back on it, there are parts of it that I still can't fully understand. My name is Dean, and I grew up in a remote part of Appalachia. I'm not going to say exactly where because I don't really want to draw attention to the area, but when I say remote, I mean remote. Right now there are probably 5 or 6 people living there, if that. Back when I was growing up, there were a few more. Maybe 30, maybe 50 people, depending on the year. Families came and went, people died, younger generations left for cities and never came back. Eventually, the place just started fading away. There were no jobs, no opportunities, no real future for anyone who wanted something beyond surviving from one month to the next. The reality is that when communities get that isolated, strange things start happening. Not supernatural things necessarily, just people. People living in their own worlds. People holding on to old feuds for decades. People developing habits and beliefs that seem completely normal to them because they've spent their entire lives surrounded by the same handful of individuals. Isolation does things to people, and that's something I didn't fully understand until I left. The person at the center of this story was a childhood friend of mine. These days he's in prison, and everything I'm about to tell you eventually played a role in how he ended up there. Growing up, we were close. But if I'm being honest, a lot of that closeness came from the simple fact that there weren't many other kids around. We were both homeschooled. Our mothers handled our education, and neither of us spent much time around people our own age. If there are only 2 boys within miles of each other, sooner or later they're going to become friends, whether they have much in common or not. Over time, we got used to each other. We played together, explored the woods together, got into trouble together. Looking back, I don't actually know if we would have been friends if we'd grown up somewhere else. Maybe we would have gone in completely different directions. But out there, when you're surrounded by mountains and the nearest neighbor is half an hour away, friendships form differently. Then my family left. My parents finally reached a point where they couldn't justify staying any longer, and we moved away. At first, we kept in touch. Then life happened, and years passed. We'd occasionally send each other a message around birthdays or holidays, but that was about it. Eventually, there were stretches of 6 months or even a year where we didn't speak at all. At some point, both of his parents passed away, and I never really understood exactly what happened to them. All I know is that it was some kind of tragedy. Then, a little over 5 years ago, I got a message from him out of nowhere. He told me he'd finally bought a house. Said he wanted to reconnect, wanted to catch up properly after all those years. Asked if I'd be interested in coming out and staying with him for a few days. I'm not going to lie. The message felt strange. We hadn't spoken consistently in almost 7 years. It wasn't like we'd been maintaining some long-distance friendship. We were practically strangers at that point. But at the same time, I didn't want to be rude. I didn't want him to feel like I'd left Appalachia and started looking down on people who stayed behind. I knew enough people who did that, acting like moving to a city suddenly made them better than everyone else. At the same time, I figured maybe he was feeling a little lonely out there, surrounded by people who were either very old or just had some pretty strange ideas about the world. So after thinking about it for a few days, I agreed. The drive back into the mountains was surprisingly emotional. I hadn't been there in years, and the further I drove, the more memories started surfacing. Old roads and familiar ridgelines. Places I hadn't thought about since I was a teenager. There's something difficult to explain about growing up in Appalachia. People leave all the time, but the mountains never really leave them. I know that sounds cliché, but anyone who spent enough time there probably understands exactly what I mean. By the time I was getting close, I actually felt pretty good about the decision. The awkwardness from the original message had mostly disappeared, replaced by a genuine curiosity about seeing someone who had once been such a huge part of my life. Then I saw the house, and I recognized it. As I pulled into the driveway, I found myself staring at it, trying to place where I'd seen it before. After a moment, it clicked. I was almost certain it had belonged to his uncle. I hadn't spent much time there growing up because my mother absolutely hated visiting that side of his family. In fact, she thought most of them were strange. She never openly forbade me from hanging out with him, but she definitely preferred when I didn't. So when I got out of the truck, I casually mentioned that I thought the house used to belong to his uncle, and his reaction was immediate. It wasn't explosive, but I saw something change in his expression. His smile faded slightly. His shoulders stiffened. For a second, he looked genuinely uncomfortable, maybe even annoyed. The moment passed quickly enough that someone else might not have noticed, but I did. Assuming I'd accidentally implied he'd inherited the place instead of earning it himself, I immediately changed the subject and started complimenting the property. The house looked good from the outside. The surrounding land was beautiful. I made sure the conversation moved away from ownership entirely, and that seemed to help, at least for a little while. The real problem started when I walked inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell. To put it bluntly, the place smelled like something had died in there. Not strongly enough to immediately send me running back outside, but strong enough that I noticed it instantly. It was a heavy, stale smell that seemed to hang in the air, a mixture of rot, mildew, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Now, I've spent plenty of time in old mountain homes. A lot of them smell strange because a lot of the older folks around there either don't have the habit or the ability to open the windows and let fresh air circulate through the house. Some haven't been properly maintained in decades, so I didn't immediately jump to conclusions. Instead, I made up an excuse. I told him I had asthma issues and asked if we could open some windows to get some fresh air moving through the house. Thankfully, he didn't question it. We opened several windows and spent the next half hour walking through the house while he showed me around. Most of the rooms looked normal enough, a little cluttered and a little neglected in places, but nothing too unusual. The bedroom I'd be using was clearly a guest room that hadn't been touched in a long time. There was dust everywhere, but at least it was functional. A quick cleanup would make it perfectly fine for a few nights. Then he mentioned something that stood out immediately. The entire second floor was off limits. I honestly didn't think much of it at first. People have private spaces. It's okay. People have rooms they don't want guests wandering into. So I simply nodded and told him that was fine. What caught me off guard wasn't the rule itself. It was the fact that he seemed almost disappointed that I didn't ask why. There was a brief pause where he looked at me expectantly, as if waiting for me to question it. When I didn't, he explained anyway. According to him, he was doing renovations upstairs. The flooring wasn't stable in certain areas. Parts of the structure needed work, and he didn't want me getting hurt while I was staying there. I remember standing there listening to the explanation and thinking that it sounded perfectly reasonable. In fact, it sounded so reasonable that I didn't give it another thought, at least at the time. But the truth is, as the days went by, I started noticing little things that didn't quite add up. I was supposed to stay there for a week, and at first everything felt normal enough. But there were moments that kept sticking with me. The first thing was how he reacted whenever we heard any kind of noise coming from inside the house. It didn't matter if we were sitting outside in the yard, drinking coffee on the porch, or just standing around talking. If there was a bang, a thump, or even the sound of something shifting inside, he would immediately tell me to stay where I was while he went to check it out. A few minutes later, he would come back with some explanation. A rat knocked something over. An old shelf shifted. A loose board fell somewhere. There was always an answer. The strange part wasn't the explanations themselves. It was the fact that he never wanted me coming with him. I remember one time in particular when we heard something crash inside the house. Not a small sound either. It sounded like something heavy had hit the floor hard enough to shake the place. Instinctively, I started getting up to follow him. But before I could even take a step, he pointed at the chair and told me to sit back down. The way he said it caught me completely off guard. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a suggestion. It was an order. His voice got sharp enough that I actually froze for a second. I must have looked uncomfortable because when he came back outside a few minutes later, he apologized and said he hadn't meant to snap at me. He told me it was his house, his responsibility, and that he preferred checking things himself. I accepted the explanation, but after that, I couldn't stop thinking about it. There was always this feeling hanging in the air, like something was happening right in front of me, and I was somehow missing it. Another thing is that I've always been an incredibly heavy sleeper. That's not an exaggeration. Once I'm asleep, I'm usually out until morning. Growing up, my family used to joke that a tornado could pass through my bedroom and I wouldn't notice. Because of that, waking up during the night is extremely rare for me. But I think it was around the third night when something happened that broke my normal routine. We'd made dinner that evening and somehow managed to oversalt almost everything. I ended up drinking way more water than usual before bed, which meant that sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. As I sat up in bed, still half asleep, I immediately heard something above me. At first, I just lay there listening. It wasn't the sound of the house settling or old wood creaking. I grew up around houses like that. I know the difference. This sounded like someone moving around upstairs. And the second I heard it, I remembered something my friend had said the day before. Completely out of nowhere, he'd asked me if I still slept as heavily as I used to when we were kids. If I still slept through the night without waking up. I remember laughing and telling him yes, that I was exactly the same. Once I fell asleep, I was usually gone until morning. What struck me at the time was how relieved he seemed by that answer. Not happy, but relieved. Back then, I hadn't thought much of it. It felt like one of those random conversations people have when they're reminiscing about childhood. But standing there in the dark, listening to somebody pacing around on a floor that supposedly wasn't being used, the memory came rushing back immediately. For several seconds, I stayed completely still, trying to convince myself there had to be some reasonable explanation. Maybe he was awake. Maybe he was moving furniture around. Maybe there really were renovations happening up there after all. But the longer I listened, the less that explanation made sense. The footsteps weren't moving around randomly. Whoever was up there seemed to be walking back and forth across the same section of floor, over and over again. I got out of bed and stepped quietly into the hallway. The house was completely dark except for a faint glow coming through one of the windows. I could still hear it. Someone was definitely upstairs. I slipped out of the bedroom as quietly as I could because the last thing I wanted was for my friend to realize I was awake. I walked down the hallway and stopped at the bottom of the staircase that led to the second floor. That's when it sounded like I heard him talking to someone. Whoever he was speaking to, he was clearly trying to keep his voice low enough that I wouldn't notice. But in the silence of the house, I could still hear it. It genuinely sounded like a conversation. The thing is, one of the things I remembered from when we were kids was that both of us, and especially me, had a habit of talking to ourselves. It sounds strange, but when you grow up that isolated, you find your own ways to process thoughts. We didn't have many people around. Sometimes the easiest way to work through something was to say it out loud. Because of that, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Living in that part of the country isn't easy. He's completely isolated, barely any neighbors, and some of the people who do live there have spent their entire lives in that valley and have no idea what the outside world even looks like. I wasn't interested in judging him or acting like I'd somehow become better than him just because I'd left. So I pushed the thought aside and went back to bed. The next day, my fourth day there, he mentioned that it was the day the local store was open. Calling it a store is honestly generous. It was really just a neighbor who sold a handful of supplies out of an old building on his property. Apparently, we needed something, though I can't even remember what it was anymore. I told him I'd go get it, partly because I didn't mind helping, and partly because there was a good chance I'd known the guy when I was younger and wanted to say hello. The conversation started normally enough. We talked about my parents, about how long it had been since I'd been back, and about how much the area had changed. Then I mentioned that I was staying at my friend's house, and the man's expression changed immediately. He looked uncomfortable. Then he told me to be careful because strange things happened in that house. I asked him what exactly he meant by that. He just shook his head and said I should be careful. That was one of the things I always hated about tiny communities like this. People refuse to get involved in each other's business. Everybody knows something, but nobody wants to be the one who says it out loud. They let things happen right in front of them because they don't want trouble with their neighbors. Still, I won't lie and say the conversation didn't bother me. It did. Because it confirmed something I'd already started feeling myself. Something wasn't right in that house. That afternoon, I made up my mind. I was going upstairs. I knew it wasn't technically my business. I knew I was staying in somebody else's home, and he'd made it very clear that he didn't want me up there. He had every right to set that boundary. But at that point, I had a bad feeling that I couldn't shake, and it had reached the point where ignoring it felt worse than breaking the rule. I remembered something about my friend from when we were younger. He was paranoid. Not in a dangerous way back then, but enough that if he thought somebody had been messing with his property, he'd immediately go investigate. So when I got back from the store, I casually told him that I'd noticed the shed door standing open and thought somebody might have been inside. It worked perfectly. I watched the concern appear on his face almost instantly. I suggested he go take a look while I put away the supplies. He nodded and headed outside without questioning it. The second I heard the front door close behind him, I took off toward the staircase. I practically ran upstairs. When I reached the top, I found the door he'd always kept off limits. It wasn't even locked, so I opened it. And what I saw in that room still bothers me 5 years later. Sitting on a bed was his uncle. The same uncle we'd been afraid of as kids. The one we used to whisper about because something about him always felt off. Only now he looked much older, much weaker, and he was so thin that it looked like the bed was holding him together. What scared me the most wasn't seeing him in such a miserable condition, but seeing him tied to that bed in a way that was completely inhumane. My first thought was that he was heavily drugged, but not so heavily drugged that he couldn't understand what was happening. And the moment he saw me, something changed in his face. For the first time since I'd walked into the room, he looked hopeful. Then he managed to force out a single word: "Help." That was all he said. At that point, I knew I had to move quickly. I didn't know exactly what was going on, but I knew enough to understand that whatever it was bad. Then I heard the front door downstairs close. My friend was coming back. I rushed downstairs as quietly as I could and tried to act normal. A few moments later, he called out, asking where I was. I told him I'd come back to my room because my stomach was bothering me and I needed to use the bathroom. Thankfully, he didn't question it. I locked myself inside and immediately called the police. I gave them the address and explained everything I'd seen. Then I waited. And that's when I heard his footsteps stop outside the bathroom door. The silence lasted only a second. Then he spoke. And I swear it was a voice I'd never heard from him before. He asked if I'd been upstairs. By then I knew he'd figured it out. I didn't know what he was going to do. I just knew it wasn't going to be good. The police were still a long way out. We were deep in the mountains, and help wasn't going to arrive quickly. So I didn't answer him, and for several seconds, neither of us said anything. Then I heard the doorknob start turning. At first, slowly, then harder. Then the entire door shook as he started throwing his weight against it. He shouted that he had a spare key, that I had nowhere to go, that sooner or later he'd be inside. And the worst part was that he was probably right. The only thing I could think of was the tiny bathroom window, and the second I heard him walk away, presumably to get the key, I forced the window open and climbed out. I was only on the first story, but the fall still messed up my leg pretty badly when I landed. But adrenaline took over, and I got up and ran. I made it into the woods and disappeared among the trees. As I moved farther into the forest, I could hear him calling my name somewhere behind me. He knew I'd escaped. He knew I was out there. And that terrified me because, unlike me, he actually knew those woods. I'd grown up there, sure, but I'd spent years living in the city. He still hunted there. He still spent his life in those mountains. If he wanted to find somebody in the forest, he'd probably find them eventually. That thought stayed with me every second I was hiding out there. But thankfully, I never had to find out. About 20 minutes later, maybe a little more, I heard sirens in the distance. And that was the end of it. The police arrested him that day. I later learned that he'd been keeping his uncle drugged so he could maintain control of the property and eventually inherit the house without any interference. The investigation uncovered enough evidence to put him away, and he's still in prison now. Even though I know that sooner or later, he'll be released again. What bothered me afterward was realizing that people around there probably knew something was wrong. Maybe not the full story, maybe not all of it, but enough. This happened 5 years ago, and for a while, it was all anybody in that area talked about. People acted shocked when the truth came out, but sometimes I wonder if they were really shocked by what he had done, or if they were shocked that somebody had finally decided to do something about it. The only thing I do know is that, because his uncle had absolutely no family support left, I decided the least I could do was help get him into a long-term care facility where he could be looked after properly. By that point, the doctors had already told us that years of being drugged had done serious damage to his body. He was incredibly weak, both physically and mentally, and they didn't believe he had much time left. The truth is, he passed away about 2 years later. But at least those last 2 years were spent somewhere safe, somewhere people actually cared whether he ate, whether he slept, whether he was comfortable, whether he was treated like a human being. Considering what he'd been living through before that, I take some comfort in knowing he was able to have at least a little peace at the end of his life. But even now, 5 years later, it still shocks me that my friend was capable of doing something like that. Then again, if I'm being completely honest with myself, it doesn't surprise me as much as I sometimes pretend it does. We grew up together. I knew him better than most people did. And even back then, there were moments when you could tell something wasn't quite right. He was never what I'd call a particularly compassionate person. He wasn't cruel for the sake of being cruel, but he had a way of looking at people that made them feel more like obstacles than human beings. What still makes me question everything to this day is why he even invited me to that house in the first place. It was almost like part of him wanted someone to know the truth, even though he clearly went out of his way to make sure I wouldn't find out. Maybe he really was that lonely and isolated, and between having company and eventually getting caught, he just chose the risk. I'm going to tell you something that might not be completely true. I believe most of it is real, and that the rest is the result of imagination filling in the gaps. I don't really know. What I do know is that I found this passage in my father's diary at a time when I shouldn't have been reading it. I was young, and I didn't always have a clear sense of what was right or wrong. But ever since I read it, I've been obsessed with the story, and I need your opinion to try to understand whether it could be real or not. And if it is real, whether it's a natural phenomenon or something more than that. Either way, it's going to be a long story, with all the details my father described. It all happened to my father in October of 1994, and even though more than 30 years have passed since then, it remains one of those stories that nobody in my family enjoys discussing for very long. The strange thing is that there was never a crime. There was never an accident. And as far as anyone knows, nothing illegal happened during that trip. My father returned home physically unharmed. He wasn't attacked. He wasn't lost for days, and he never claimed to have witnessed anything supernatural. Yet whenever the subject came up over the years, a noticeable discomfort settled over the room. The story always ended the same way, with everyone becoming quiet and eventually changing the subject. As I got older, I began to understand why. Before I explain what happened, it's important to understand the place where it happened. Deep within the Great Smoky Mountains of western North Carolina lies an area known as Hazel Creek. Today, most visitors see the Smokies as endless forests, mountain ridges, streams, and hiking trails stretching across protected wilderness. What many people don't realize is that thousands of people once lived throughout those mountains. Entire communities occupied valleys that are now covered by trees. Families built farms, churches, schools, stores, and homes in places that modern visitors walk through without realizing they are standing where generations of people once lived their entire lives. Hazel Creek was one of those communities. Before World War II, it was home to hundreds of residents who made their living through farming, logging, and small local businesses. Then came the construction of Fontana Dam. The dam created Fontana Lake, flooding large sections of the region and cutting off direct access to many communities on the north side of the water. Families were forced to leave land that had belonged to them for generations. They were promised a road along the northern shoreline that would allow future access to the cemeteries and former settlements. But that road was never completed. Decades passed, forests reclaimed old fields, buildings collapsed, and roads disappeared beneath vegetation. The cemeteries remained, but many could only be reached by boat or by long hikes through the mountains. My father's family had roots in that area. His grandfather had spent part of his childhood near Hazel Creek before the relocation. Throughout his life, he told stories about orchards, church gatherings, mountain roads, and neighbors whose names had long since vanished from local memory. Most of those stories sounded ordinary when my father was young. They were simply stories about a place that no longer existed. But after his grandfather passed away in 1993, my father inherited several boxes filled with family photographs, handwritten notes, old letters, and property records dating back decades. What started as simple curiosity slowly became something closer to an obsession for him. Night after night, he sat at the kitchen table, sorting through fading photographs of people he barely recognized. Some images showed family members standing in front of houses that no longer existed. Others captured church picnics, school groups, and family gatherings in locations that had disappeared from maps generations earlier. The more he studied them, the more he became fascinated by the idea that entire communities had effectively been erased from the landscape. One photograph captured his attention more than any other. It showed a small farmhouse sitting at the base of a wooded hillside. Several apple trees stood behind the house, and a narrow dirt road curved through the foreground. Written on the back in faded pencil were only 4 words: Home Place, Hazel Creek, 1938. There was no address, no family name, and no indication of where exactly the picture had been taken. For months, my father found himself returning to that photograph. Eventually, he decided that he wanted to see whatever remained of the area for himself. He knew the house was gone. He knew the road had likely disappeared decades earlier. Still, he wanted to walk the same ground his family had once known. In early October, he arranged transportation across Fontana Lake with a local boat service that regularly carried fishermen and hikers into remote sections of the national park. The trip itself wasn't unusual. People made similar crossings every year. The weather forecast predicted mild temperatures, clear visibility, and calm water. He packed a small backpack containing food, water, a flashlight, a topographic map, and several copies of old family photographs. His plan was straightforward. He would spend the day exploring old trails, visit a family cemetery, attempt to locate the approximate area shown in the photograph, and return on the afternoon boat. The morning began before sunrise. A thin layer of fog hovered over Fontana Lake as the boat departed from the marina. The mountains surrounding the water rose sharply into the darkness, their ridgelines barely visible against the fading night sky. As the boat moved farther from shore, my father found himself staring across the lake, trying to imagine what the landscape had looked like before the water arrived. Somewhere beneath the surface lay roads that people had once traveled every day. Foundations remained submerged beneath dozens of feet of water. Entire sections of local history rested below the lake, invisible to everyone passing overhead. The crossing lasted less than an hour, but according to my father, it felt much longer. There was something unsettling about moving through a place where the geography itself represented a permanent loss. By mid-morning, he stepped onto the shoreline near Hazel Creek. A handful of fishermen headed in one direction while a group of backpackers disappeared into the forest. Within minutes, he found himself completely alone. The trail followed the creek through a broad valley surrounded by steep ridges that climbed thousands of feet toward the skyline. The forest was dense but beautiful, dominated by hardwoods beginning to display the first signs of autumn color. Sunlight filtered through the canopy and reflected off the creek, creating flashes of silver between the trees. For the first hour, the hike felt peaceful. The trail was well maintained, and the sounds of flowing water accompanied him almost constantly. As he moved deeper into the valley, however, subtle reminders of the past began appearing around him. He passed old stone walls standing alone among the trees. He noticed clusters of daffodils growing far from any modern settlement. Several ancient apple trees still produced fruit despite decades of neglect. In multiple locations, rectangular depressions in the ground suggested the outlines of long collapsed structures. None of these discoveries were scary on their own, but together they created a strange impression. It felt less like hiking through wilderness and more like walking through the remains of a forgotten civilization that had been slowly consumed by nature. Everywhere he looked, evidence of former lives remained hidden just beneath the surface. Around noon, he reached one of the old family cemeteries. The site sat on a gentle rise above the creek, surrounded by towering trees. Moss covered many of the headstones, and fallen leaves had gathered between the graves. Some markers remained clearly readable, while others had become nearly impossible to decipher. He spent over an hour there, comparing names against family records and studying dates. Entire generations rested beneath those trees. Infants, farmers, mothers, veterans, children. Some had lived long lives. Others had died before reaching adulthood. Looking across the cemetery, my father became aware of how isolated these graves had become. The people buried there once lived within walking distance of one another. They attended the same churches, shared meals, worked together, and raised families in neighboring valleys. Now their descendants often needed boats simply to visit them. After leaving the cemetery, he decided to continue farther up the valley than originally planned. The weather remained perfect, and he felt confident navigating the area. Using old photographs and a topographic map, he began searching for landmarks that might help identify the location of the farmhouse. Several hours passed. He crossed small streams, followed sections of abandoned roadbeds, and explored clearings where buildings had once stood. Eventually, he discovered a hillside containing several ancient apple trees remarkably similar to those visible in the photograph. Nearby, hidden beneath thick vegetation, lay the remains of a stone foundation. For the first time all day, he felt convinced he had found something significant. Then he noticed the footprints. The soil surrounding the foundation was soft from rainfall earlier that week. Several clear boot prints crossed the area. They weren't old. They appeared recent enough that their edges remained sharply defined. At first he assumed they belonged to another hiker. That wouldn't have been unusual. But after examining them more closely, he realized something interesting. Whoever had left them seemed to have spent considerable time around the site and was barefoot. The tracks circled the foundation repeatedly before disappearing into the woods beyond the orchard. Someone had been there, and not very long ago. At that moment, my father experienced something he later struggled to explain. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was a growing awareness that, despite the vast isolation surrounding him, he might not be alone in the valley after all. And as the afternoon sunlight began sinking lower between the ridges, that feeling only grew stronger. The feeling followed him for the next hour, not as a sudden burst of fear, but as a slow and persistent awareness that refused to leave his mind. He continued exploring the hillside, examining the foundation and comparing it to the old photograph he had carried all day, but his attention kept drifting back toward the woods surrounding him. The forest itself appeared completely normal. Sunlight still filtered through the trees. Squirrels moved through the undergrowth. The creek could be heard in the distance below the slope. Nothing about the environment suggested danger. Yet every so often he would stop what he was doing and look over his shoulder without really knowing why. It was almost as if someone was there with him without actually being there. Every now and then, he would walk through pockets of air that felt noticeably colder than the surrounding forest. And on more than one occasion, he experienced the unsettling sensation of something lightly brushing against him, just enough to send a chill down his spine. Yet whenever he stopped and looked over his shoulder, there was nothing there. No person, no animal, nothing that could explain it. He eventually convinced himself that the isolation was playing tricks on his mind. After all, spending hours alone in a remote valley has a way of heightening your senses and making ordinary things feel far more significant than they really are. Another thing is that the topography of Hazel Creek has a strange effect on perception. The valley is long and enclosed by steep mountain ridges that seem to absorb sound rather than carry it. Distances become more difficult to judge. A noise that appears nearby may actually originate hundreds of yards away. A person can disappear behind a fold in the terrain almost instantly. This is actually a very common feeling in isolated places like this. However, here, it felt as though there was a deeper meaning behind it all. Even during daylight, there are sections where the forest feels isolated in a way that is difficult to describe unless you've spent time in remote mountain country. My father had hunted and fished throughout Appalachia for years, so solitude was nothing new to him. What unsettled him was the growing sense that he was standing inside a place that still belonged to someone, even though almost everyone connected to it had been gone for decades. Eventually, he decided to start making his way back toward the landing area. The return boat wasn't scheduled until later that afternoon, but mountain daylight disappears quickly in October, especially inside deep valleys where the ridgelines block the sun long before sunset. He packed away the photographs, took one last look at the foundation, and began following what appeared to be an old roadbed leading downhill. As my father continued moving downhill, following what he believed to be the remains of the old roadbed, he began to notice something that hadn't been there earlier in the day, a subtle but persistent sense of disorientation that didn't make much sense given his experience in terrain like that. Up until that point, he had navigated without any real difficulty, reading the land the way he always had, keeping track of the creek, the slope of the ridges, the direction of the light. But now it felt like those reference points were slipping away from him. At the same time, the strange sensations he had brushed off earlier started becoming more noticeable. The colder pockets of air seemed more frequent, more defined, and that faint feeling of something brushing against him, like fingertips just barely grazing his arm or the back of his neck, was no longer something he could easily ignore. It wasn't constant, but it happened often enough that it began to get inside his head, making it harder for him to focus on where he was going. Eventually, he reached a point where he had to stop and admit to himself that he didn't recognize the exact stretch of ground he was standing on. He knew he was still somewhere within the same general area, but he couldn't confidently say which direction would take him back toward the landing. That was when the realization hit him that the moment he actively tried to leave, the confusion had actually gotten worse. Not long after that, he heard something behind him that immediately stood out from the background noise of the forest. Up until then, everything had blended together in the way it usually does out there. Wind through leaves, distant water, small animals moving through brush. But this sound was different. It had weight to it, a distinct snap like something solid pressing down on a dry piece of wood. He turned quickly, and for a brief moment, he saw a figure. It was a man, partially concealed behind a cluster of trees, standing still enough that if my father hadn't turned at exactly that moment, he probably wouldn't have noticed him at all. The reaction was immediate and instinctive. He didn't call out, didn't try to figure out who it was or what they were doing there. He just ran. The situation made no sense to him, being watched in a place that isolated, already disoriented, already unsettled. And the idea of someone deliberately hiding from him was enough to push him into a bit of panic. He moved as fast as he could through the trees, trying to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever he had just seen. The problem was that no matter how far he went, it didn't feel like he was actually getting anywhere. The terrain began to feel repetitive in a way that didn't line up with how he had come through it earlier. He would pass a cluster of rocks, a fallen tree, a bend in the slope, and then, minutes later, see something that looked almost identical. At first, he told himself it was just the nature of the forest, that everything starts to look the same when you're tired and moving too fast. But deep down, he knew that wasn't entirely true. There was a growing sense that he was circling without meaning to, that he was being pulled back into the same space over and over again. At some point, he became aware of a voice behind him. It wasn't loud, it didn't echo, but it was close enough that it cut through everything else. It was calling out to him, telling him to stop, to wait. By then, the fear had shifted into something more desperate. It wasn't just about being followed anymore. It was about not being able to leave, about the possibility that he might actually be stuck there with no clear way back. He eventually stopped running and hid behind a tree, more out of exhaustion than strategy, trying to steady his breathing while listening for any sign of movement. The voice came closer, and when it did, there was a change in its tone that caught him off guard. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't rushed, and it didn't carry the kind of edge you would expect from someone chasing another person through the woods. It sounded calm, almost reassuring, telling him not to be afraid, that there was no intention to harm him, only to help. For reasons he couldn't fully explain, something about that voice felt genuine to him. It wasn't just the words themselves, it was the way they were said, steady and controlled, grounded in a way that cut through the panic he had been building up. Slowly, with nowhere else to go and no real way to keep running, he stepped out from behind the tree. The man standing there didn't look threatening. There was nothing outwardly strange about him, despite his clothing and the sense of isolation weighing on him. There was something in his presence that made it clear he belonged there in a way my father did not. He explained, without urgency, that the area they were in wasn't like the rest of the mountains, that people who wandered too far into certain parts of it didn't always find their way back out. He described it less like a physical trap and more like something that held on to people, something tied to what remained of the place and the lives that had once filled it. According to him, there were forces there, whether you called them spirits or something else, that interfered with a person's sense of direction, their perception, even their emotions, making it harder and harder to leave the longer they stayed. He said his family had lived in that area for generations, long enough that he had learned how to exist within it without being affected in the same way, and that over time, helping others find their way out had become something close to a responsibility for him. Not everyone made it. Some people, he said, never managed to break free from that confusion and eventually lost themselves completely. My father later wrote that what convinced him wasn't just what the man said, but the way he said it, and more than that, the look in his eyes. There was a warmth there that didn't match the isolation of the place, something steady and human that grounded everything else he was hearing. It made it easier to believe that this wasn't a trick, that this wasn't another layer of whatever had been affecting him. The man showed him a direction, pointing out a path that didn't look any different from the others at first glance. But once my father started following it, something shifted. The confusion that had been building in his head began to ease, not all at once, but enough for him to recognize landmarks again, to feel like he was actually moving somewhere instead of in circles. Eventually, he found his way back to the main trail, and from there, back to the shoreline where the boat was scheduled to pick him up. He made it just in time. According to him, if he had been even a few minutes later, he would have missed it entirely. He thanked the man before leaving, though he never described exactly how that moment ended, only that he turned back once, and the man was no longer there in the way you would expect someone to be if they had just been standing nearby. After that, he returned home physically unharmed, just like I said at the beginning. Nothing had happened that could be easily explained as an injury or an incident. But something about him had changed. It wasn't obvious at first, and it wasn't anything outwardly alarming. It was more subtle than that, like a weight that hadn't been there before. He became quieter, more withdrawn at times, as if part of him was still somewhere else, still trying to process something he couldn't fully put into words. I've tried to talk to him about it over the years, though never directly in a way that would make it clear I had read his journal. I think he suspects that I have, even if he's never said it. The truth is, I don't know what to believe about what he experienced. There are explanations, natural ones, psychological ones, things about isolation and terrain that can affect the mind in ways people underestimate. But at the same time, the consistency of what he described, the way he wrote about those sensations before he ever encountered the man, makes it harder to dismiss completely. Hazel Creek for me has become something more than just a place on a map. It's something unresolved, something that sits in the back of my mind in a way I can't quite ignore. I've thought about going there myself one day, not out of curiosity alone, but to see if any part of what he described still lingers. If it does, then I think I'd want to know. And if it doesn't, I'm not sure that would be any more reassuring.